hello there, and welcome to Sleepwalk Space, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're examining something that's been running the show all along, pulling strings you didn't know existed, writing scripts you thought were yours. Not a force you can see or touch, not quite an emotion or a thought, and yet it orchestrates your choices, your cravings, your very sense of what matters. Dopamine, the brain's puppet master, conductor, and sometimes its quiet captor. It gets credit for every success and blame for every failure. It's the force behind every decision, the invisible hand in every choice, the whisper that says yes before you even think to ask. But is it really controlling us? Or are we just beginning to see how deep the strings go? Before we trace its invisible grip, its silent commands and hidden dominion, I'd love to know. Where are you listening from tonight? And what choices has dopamine been making for you today? If you find comfort in these quiet explorations, if this gives your thoughts a soft place to rest, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this episode a like. Maybe even subscribed. It helps this little channel find others looking for a gentle pause too. Now, settle in. Close the tabs. Soften your shoulders. Let the weight of the day melt just a little more. Because in the machinery of your mind, there's a controller you've never met. One molecule at a time. Let's begin. Dopamine doesn't ask permission when it takes control. It doesn't negotiate or explain or wait for your approval. It operates quietly, invisibly, like a director calling shots from the shadows or the current beneath still water. It's the force behind the hand that reaches, the impulse that scrolls, the decision that wasn't quite a decision at all. And yet, for something so hidden, so microscopic, it has a remarkable talent for running the show, for determining what you'll do next, what you'll want next, who you'll become next. Imagine this. You're sitting at your desk, trying to work. You tell yourself, just focus for 30 minutes. But your hand moves. Not dramatically, not consciously, just a small drift toward your phone. You don't remember deciding. You don't recall making a choice. But suddenly, you're scrolling, and 5 minutes have vanished, and you're looking at things you didn't plan to see. That invisible theft of attention, that hijacking of intention. It's dopamine. Or consider this. You're at a party, feeling fine, and then someone walks in. Your pupils dilate. Your heart rate shifts. Your attention locks. You didn't choose this. You didn't sit down and think, I will now become interested in that person. But dopamine decided for you. It saw something, some pattern, some possibility, and it moved your spotlight without asking. We like to think of dopamine as a helper, a motivator, the chemical that gives us drive. But that's not the whole story. It's not just helping, it's controlling, directing, orchestrating every major choice and 1,000 micro-choices you never even notice. It's not the voice in your head. It's the voice before the voice, the signal beneath the thought, the command that feels like desire but might be closer to compulsion. Dopamine doesn't wait for your conscious mind to catch up. It acts first, decides first, moves first. And then your brain, your storytelling, rationalizing, explaining brain, comes along after and says, I chose that. But did you? Or did dopamine choose, and you just narrated? There's a strange tension here. We pride ourselves on free will, on autonomy, on being the authors of our own lives. But underneath every choice, beneath every impulse and intention, is a slow, relentless chemical choreography. A molecule that doesn't care about your plans, your values, your long-term happiness. It only cares about one thing, More. More of what felt good last time. More of what promised reward. More of what lit up the circuits, even if it hurt you, even if you regretted it, even if you swore you'd never do it again. Dopamine doesn't have morals. It has patterns. It doesn't have wisdom. It has memory. And it remembers everything that spiked its signal, the sugar that gave you a rush, the notification that gave you a thrill, the risk that gave you a story, the person who gave you hope. And it whispers again, again, again. Not because it's good for you, just because it worked before. You might not realize how much of your day is scripted by this molecule. The alarm goes off. You reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. That's dopamine. You skip breakfast but grab coffee. Dopamine. You check your email, your messages, your feed, not because you need to, but because the maybe pulls you. Dopamine. You start a task, get bored, switch to another. Dopamine guiding your focus like a restless shepherd. You buy something you don't need because it was on sale, because it promised a feeling, because in that moment, the future version of you with that thing seemed better than the current version without it. Dopamine sold you the story. You even procrastinate because of dopamine, not despite it, because of it. Because the dopamine hit from avoiding discomfort, from choosing the easy path, from scrolling instead of working, that hit comes faster than the slow, distant reward of finishing the hard thing. Your brain is doing math, unconscious math, and dopamine is the currency. It asks, which action gives me the quickest return? And it steers you there, even when you know better. Here's the thing. We often assume dopamine fires when we get what we want, but research shows the opposite. The biggest surge happens before the reward, in the anticipation, in the hunt, in the space between wanting and having. Not the meal, the menu, not the vacation, the countdown, not the relationship, the crush, the uncertainty, the possibility, the chance that this time might be different. That's where dopamine lives. It's why gambling is so devastating. Not because people win, but because they might. It's why dating apps are so addictive. Not because of love, but because of maybe. It's why cliffhangers work, why unread messages haunt you, why you can't stop checking if something new has arrived. Dopamine thrives in the unknown. It feeds on potential. And in a world engineered to deliver infinite potential, infinite newness, infinite maybe, it's no wonder we feel controlled. In psychology, there's a concept called intermittent reinforcement. It means you don't get rewarded every time, just sometimes. And that sometimes is the most addictive pattern there is. More addictive than always. More powerful than never. Because your brain learns to expect a reward, but never knows when. So it stays alert, stays ready, stays hooked. Every slot machine, every social media feed, every variable reward system in existence is built on this principle. And your dopamine system falls for it every single time. Not because you're weak, because it's designed to. This is how habits form. Not through logic, not through willpower, but through tiny chemical breadcrumbs. Dopamine marks the trail, and your behavior follows. You do something. It feels good or promising. Dopamine fires. The pathway strengthens. Next time, the behavior comes easier, then easier still, until one day you're not choosing anymore. You're repeating. The habit has taken root, and dopamine is watering it whether you like it or not. And this works for good habits and bad ones. The morning jog that makes you feel alive. That's a dopamine loop. The doom scrolling that makes you feel numb. Also, a dopamine loop. The system doesn't judge. It just learns. What you repeat, it amplifies. What you reward, it remembers. So if your life feels like it's on autopilot, if you keep doing things you don't really want to do, if you feel trapped in patterns you can't explain, it's not a moral failure. It's neurochemistry. It's dopamine running scripts you wrote years ago, maybe decades ago, and never thought to revise. But here's the paradox. Dopamine isn't just the controller. It's also the architect of meaning. Every significant moment in your life, every memory that matters, every experience that shaped you, dopamine was there, tagging it, marking it, saying, "Remember this." It helped you learn what's dangerous and what's safe. It helped you recognize faces, predict outcomes, find patterns in chaos. It helped you survive. And more than that, it helped you become human. Because humans don't just react to the world. We anticipate it. We imagine futures. We set goals that don't exist yet and feel motivated by them. That's all dopamine. No other animal can dream of a career, work toward an abstract idea, or feel driven by purpose. But we can, because our dopamine system evolved to reward not just immediate pleasures, but distant imagined ones. The promotion you're working toward, the book you're writing, the person you're becoming. None of these are real yet, but dopamine treats them like they are. It releases in anticipation of the future you, and that anticipation becomes fuel. So dopamine is paradox. It's the force that traps you in loops, and the force that pulls you toward growth. It's the reason you can't stop scrolling, and the reason you can't stop dreaming. It's the chemical of addiction, and the chemical of ambition. And the line between those two is thinner than we like to admit. Because what is ambition but a socially acceptable addiction to achievement? What is passion but a dopamine loop you're proud of? The system is the same. The molecule is the same. The only difference is the story you tell about it. When dopamine drives you toward health, creativity, connection, we call it motivation. When it drives you toward excess, compulsion, escape, we call it addiction. But the brain doesn't know the difference. It's just following the signal. And the signal says, "This mattered last time. Let's do it again." So here's the uncomfortable truth. You're not entirely in control, not because you're flawed, but because control was never fully yours to begin with. Every decision you make is influenced, shaped, nudged by a chemical system that operates below the surface of awareness. And that system, while remarkable, while essential, while beautiful in its way, is also deeply vulnerable to hijacking. Modern life knows this. Every app, every ad, every platform is designed with your dopamine system in mind. They study it. They optimize for it. They run tests to see which version makes you click more, stay longer, come back faster. They are not selling you products. They are buying your dopamine. And you, without meaning to, are selling. Because every time you feel that little buzz of novelty, that tiny spark of maybe this will be good, you're experiencing a biological response that took millions of years to evolve, now being triggered by a notification designed in a lab. Your ancestors used dopamine to find food, avoid predators, choose mates. You use it to scroll past strangers, double-tap photos, refresh inboxes. The hardware is ancient. The software is modern. And the mismatch is making us sick. We see it everywhere now. Rising rates of anxiety, depression, addiction, burnout. And underneath it all, a common thread. Dopamine dysregulation. Not too little, not too much, but misaligned. Firing for things that don't nourish, silent for things that do. We've trained our brains to expect constant stimulation, constant novelty, constant reward. And when life, real life, slow life, boring life shows up, it doesn't register. The dopamine doesn't fire. So we feel flat. Not sad, necessarily, just absent. Like the color has drained out. This is what researchers call anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. But it's not that pleasure is gone. It's that the system is exhausted, overstimulated, and undernourished. Like a muscle worked to failure, it stops responding. But here's the hope. The system can heal. Dopamine pathways can be rewritten, not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. Because the same mechanism that built the bad loops can build better ones. It's called neuroplasticity, and it means your brain is not fixed. It's adaptive, changeable, learning, always learning. So if you've been teaching it to crave junk, you can teach it to crave joy. If you've been rewarding distraction, you can start rewarding presence. If you've been chasing spikes, you can learn to appreciate rhythms. It takes time, it takes intention, but it's possible. And maybe that's the real story. Not that dopamine controls your life, but that it reflects your life. It learns from what you do, what you choose, what you repeat. And if you don't like what it's learned, you can teach it something new. Not by fighting it, not by shaming it, but by gently, patiently, consistently showing it a different path. A path where the reward isn't loud or fast or shiny, where the reward is real, where the dopamine doesn't spike and crash but flows, steady and nourishing, like a river that's found its course. That's the journey we're on tonight. Not to defeat dopamine, but to understand it, to see it clearly, to recognize when it's helping and when it's hurting, to reclaim some small measure of authorship in a life that often feels written by forces beyond our control. Because you are more than your neurochemistry. You are the awareness of it, the observer, the one who can notice the pull and choose not to follow, the one who can feel the craving and let it pass, the one who can say kindly, gently, to the molecule inside, I see you, I hear you, but I'm steering from here. So let's keep walking together, let's trace the threads, let's see how deep the control goes, and maybe, just maybe, find a little freedom in the seeing. Long before we had labs, long before we had language for neurotransmitters or reward pathways, we had the feeling, that pull, that itch, that whisper in the chest that says, do this, want that, go there. Ancient humans didn't call it dopamine, but they lived it. They felt the surge when the hunt succeeded, the drive that sent them over the next hill, the pull toward fire, toward food, toward each other. They felt craving without naming it, desire without dissecting it, and they tried to explain it the only way they could through story. In nearly every culture, across every age, humans have personified this force. In Greek mythology, Eros was the god of desire, shooting golden arrows into hearts that had no defense. Once struck, you were changed. You wanted. You pursued. You had no choice. Eros didn't ask. He commanded. In Hindu tradition, Kama represented desire, pleasure, longing. But unlike the Western framing of desire as sin, Kama was sacred, one of the 4 aims of life. Not something to be resisted, but integrated, navigated, honored. Buddhism took a different view. Tanha, or craving, was named as the root of suffering, not because wanting is evil, but because it's endless. One desire satisfied births another. The mind becomes tangled, always reaching, never arriving. And beneath the doctrine was an observation. Something inside us pulls constantly, and if we follow blindly, we suffer. Christian theology spoke of temptation, the pull toward the forbidden, the voice that says, just once, just this, just a little more. They understood that something internal could override reason, could whisper louder than conscience. They called it the devil, the flesh, the fall. But really, they were naming the same thing, a force inside that wants, regardless of consequence. In Norse mythology, berserkers entered battle frenzies, consumed by rage and power unstoppable. Modern scholars suggest mushrooms, ritualistic trance, maybe even a neurochemical storm of dopamine and adrenaline. A system flooded, control surrendered, the body acting on pure drive. In Chinese medicine, qi flowed through the body, animating action, emotion, health. Though broader than one molecule, it captured the idea. Something unseen moves through us, directs us, makes us alive. And the alchemists believed the body was a furnace of transformation. That base desires could be transmuted into higher purpose, that the same energy that pulls you toward indulgence could, if refined, pull you toward enlightenment. They didn't have microscopes, but they knew desire has structure, craving has chemistry, and the force that moves you can be poison or power, depending on how you relate to it. Then the Enlightenment arrived, and the mystical began its slow shift toward the mechanical. Philosophers like David Hume wrote that reason is slave to the passions, that no matter how logical we think we are, emotion drives the carriage. Reason just holds the reins. This was radical. It suggested that we are not ruled by thought, but by feeling, by drive, by forces that operate beneath the surface of consciousness. Still, for centuries, motivation was explained through character, through virtue or vice, through willpower. If you lacked drive, you were lazy. If you craved too much, you were gluttonous. Moral categories imposed on biological realities. Then, in 1957, everything shifted. Two scientists, Kathleen Montague and Arvid Carlson, isolated a molecule in the brain, a catecholamine, chemically similar to adrenaline. At first, no one was sure what it did, but Carlson kept looking. In 1958, he discovered that this molecule, dopamine, was essential. Not just present, but necessary. For movement, for mood, for motivation. He traced its pathways, from the substantia nigra to the striatum, from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. He saw how it flowed through the brain's reward centers, how it responded to pleasure, to surprise, to novelty, and suddenly we had a map, a chemical explanation for something we'd only ever explained with metaphor. Carlson won the Nobel Prize in 2000. But even after we named it, measured it, mapped it, we still struggled to understand it. Because dopamine isn't simple. It's not just one thing. It's not pleasure. It's not happiness. It's not even desire in the way we usually mean it. It's more like the signal that says, pay attention, this might matter. It's the brain's way of highlighting what's important, what's new, what's worth remembering, what's worth doing again. And that signal, that tiny molecular whisper, has shaped everything. Every invention, every exploration, every risk, every leap, every human achievement can be traced back, at least in part, to dopamine saying, what if? What if there's more over that hill? What if this works? What if we try? It's the force that sent humans out of Africa, across oceans, into space. Not because we needed to, because something in us wanted to. Because dopamine doesn't just respond to reward. It anticipates it. It imagines it. It dreams it into being. But here's where the story turns. Because in the modern world, dopamine has been weaponized. not by evil scientists in labs, but by engineers, designers, behavioral psychologists working for companies that want your time, your attention, your money. They study dopamine. They map how it fires. They optimize for engagement, which is just another word for addiction. Every notification is timed. Every feed is personalized. Every variable reward, likes, comments, matches, is calibrated to keep you coming back. Not because it makes you happy, because it makes you hope. Hope that the next swipe will be better. Hope that the next post will land. Hope that the next refresh will bring something good. And hope, neurologically, is dopamine. It's anticipation without guarantee. Possibility without proof. The perfect recipe for compulsion. Social media companies don't sell you products. They sell your dopamine to advertisers. Every minute you spend scrolling is a minute your reward system is firing, signaling, marking moments as important even when they're not. Your brain can't tell the difference between a genuine reward and an engineered one. It just knows something happened. Let's do it again. And so we do, again and again. Checking, scrolling, refreshing, hunting for the next hit. Not because we're weak, because we're human. Because our dopamine system evolved in an environment of scarcity, where rewards were rare, effort was high, and the next meal was never guaranteed. Now we live in an environment of abundance, infinite content, infinite options, infinite stimulation. And our ancient reward system, designed for a world that no longer exists, is overwhelmed. It's like giving a sugar-starved hunter-gatherer unlimited access to candy. They wouldn't stop eating. Not because they're gluttonous, because their brain is screaming, "Get it while you can." This is rare. Stock up. That's what's happening now. Our dopamine systems are screaming, more, more, more. Not because we need it, because the system doesn't know we don't. It's still preparing for famine in a world of feast, and the result is exhaustion, overstimulation, a flattening of joy. When everything promises reward, nothing feels rewarding. When every moment is optimized for engagement, nothing feels meaningful. We've become dopamine rich and satisfaction poor. But the story doesn't end there, because awareness changes everything. Once you see the system, once you understand how it works, you can start to work with it instead of against it. You can recognize when you're being manipulated, when a design choice is exploiting your biology, when a craving is chemical, not real. And in that recognition, there's freedom. Not total freedom, not control, but space. Space to pause. Space to choose. Space to ask, is this what I really want, or is this just dopamine talking? That space, that small gap between impulse and action, is where you live. That's where agency begins. Not in the absence of dopamine, but in the awareness of it. Because dopamine will always whisper. It will always pull. That's its job. But you don't have to follow every time. You can learn to distinguish between the pulls that nourish and the pulls that drain, between the loops that build and the loops that break. And slowly, gently, you can start to reclaim the pen. Start to write your own story, instead of letting a molecule write it for you. If you could zoom all the way in past thought, past blood, past the electrical storms of your brain, you'd find a conversation happening. Not in words, but in molecules. Tiny chemical messengers drifting across microscopic gaps, whispering from one neuron to the next. This is the language of your nervous system. And dopamine is one of its most fluent speakers. So what is it really? Chemically, dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a signaling molecule. It belongs to a family called catecholamines, which includes adrenaline and noradrenaline, the chemicals of stress and arousal. It's synthesized in your brain from an amino acid called tyrosine, which you get from food, eggs, cheese, almonds, chicken. Inside certain neurons, tyrosine is converted into L-dopa, then into dopamine. From there, it either acts directly or gets transformed into those other catecholamines, depending on what your body needs. But dopamine doesn't just float randomly. It travels specific routes, like trains on tracks, delivering messages to precise destinations. There are 4 main dopamine pathways in the brain, and each one controls something different. Each one tells a different part of your story. The first is the mesolimbic pathway, often called the reward pathway. This is the famous one, the one that lights up in brain scans when you eat chocolate, hear good news, or win a game. It runs from the ventral tegmental area deep in the midbrain to the nucleus accumbens, a region critical for motivation and pleasure. When this pathway fires, it's saying, "That was good, do that again." It's how your brain learns what to pursue, what to repeat, what to care about. But it doesn't just respond to actual rewards. It responds to the prediction of reward. The cue, the signal, the hint that something good might be coming. That's why you feel a little rush when you hear a notification sound, even before you check it. That's why your heart skips when someone says, "I have news." The mesolimbic pathway is already firing, already marking the moment, already saying, "Pay attention." This is one reason dopamine is so central to addiction. Drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, they flood this pathway with dopamine far more than any natural reward. The system learns fast and hard. This is the most important thing. Do this again. And because the signal is so strong, it overrides everything else. Food, sleep, relationships, safety. The brain recalibrates. Normal pleasures stop registering. Only the drug feels like it matters. This isn't a moral failure. It's a hijacked learning system. Dopamine doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Mark what's important. Except now, the marker is broken. The second pathway is the mesocortical pathway, which connects the same midbrain region to the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain. This is where dopamine helps with planning, focus, decision-making, working memory. When you concentrate deeply on a task, when you weigh options, when you resist a temptation because you're thinking ahead, this is the pathway at work. In conditions like ADHD, this pathway is often underactive. Dopamine isn't flowing as strongly to the prefrontal cortex, which makes sustained attention harder. The brain struggles to hold on to goals, to filter out distractions, to care about future consequences. Stimulant medications like Ritalin and Adderall work by increasing dopamine availability in this pathway, helping the signal get through. Not to create artificial focus, but to restore the natural circuitry that helps you choose where your attention goes. This pathway is also involved in emotional regulation. When it's disrupted, you might feel unmotivated, forgetful, scattered, or emotionally flat. It's not laziness, it's chemistry. The signal isn't reaching where it needs to go. The third pathway is the nigrostriatal pathway, which runs from the substantia nigra to the striatum. This one is all about movement. Smooth, coordinated, intentional movement. Walk, reach, type, dance, all of it requires dopamine flowing through this pathway. In Parkinson's disease, the neurons in the substantia nigra begin to die. Dopamine production drops, and movement becomes difficult. Tremors, stiffness, slowness. It's not a muscle problem. It's a signal problem. The command to move isn't getting through. L-Dopa, the precursor to dopamine, is often used as treatment. It doesn't cure the disease, but it helps restore some of the lost signal, allowing movement to flow more easily. This pathway is a reminder that dopamine isn't just about feelings or desires. It's about function. It's woven into the basic mechanics of being alive. The ability to move through space, to act on your intentions, to inhabit your body, all of it depends on this molecule. The fourth pathway is the tuberoinfundibular pathway, which connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. This one regulates hormones, especially prolactin, which affects reproduction, lactation, and sexual function. It's quieter, less discussed, but essential. A reminder that dopamine doesn't just live in your head. It's part of your entire endocrine system. It influences when and how your body prepares for intimacy, for parenthood, for connection. It's not just what you want. It's how your body supports those wants. So these four pathways, together, they create the architecture of drive, of motion, of focus, of reproduction, of survival. They're not separate systems. They're interwoven, constantly talking to each other, adjusting based on feedback. And all of it, depends on tiny molecules drifting across tiny gaps. Here's how it works. Two neurons sit side by side, almost touching, but they don't touch. There's a gap between them, called a synapse. The first neuron, when it's activated, releases dopamine into that gap. The dopamine floats across and binds to receptors on the second neuron. Receptors are like locks. Dopamine is the key. When it clicks into place, the second neuron changes. It might fire an electrical signal. It might release its own chemicals. It might become more or less sensitive to future signals. But the message has been delivered. Then, just as quickly, the dopamine is cleared. Either it's reabsorbed by the first neuron, a process called reuptake, or it's broken down by enzymes. The synapse resets. Ready for the next signal. This is where drugs come in. Cocaine, for example, blocks reuptake. It prevents dopamine from being cleared, so it lingers in the synapse, keeps binding, keeps firing. The signal is amplified. The reward feels huge. But the brain adapts. It downregulates receptors, meaning it produces fewer locks for dopamine to fit into. Now, you need more dopamine to feel the same effect. Tolerance builds. The chase intensifies. The system that was designed to learn what's good becomes a trap. Methamphetamine goes even further. It not only blocks reuptake, but also forces neurons to release more dopamine. It floods the system. The result is euphoria, energy, invincibility, followed by a crash, exhaustion, depression. The system is drained, and over time it can be damaged. Neurons die. Receptors are lost. The ability to feel pleasure at all diminishes. This is why addiction is so brutal. It's not about wanting to feel good. It's about needing to feel normal. The brain has been rewired, and without the drug, the person is left in a dopamine deficit. Flat, empty, hopeless. Recovery is possible, but it takes time. The brain can heal, can grow new receptors, can restore balance, but it's slow. And it requires something the system often lacks, the ability to feel rewarded by anything other than the substance that hijacked it. But drugs aren't the only hijackers. Behaviors can do it too. Gambling activates the same pathways. The anticipation, the risk, the maybe. It's a dopamine jackpot, literally. Video games, designed with leveling systems, loot boxes, achievements, they're dopamine slot machines. Every win, every unlock, every rare drop, it's a carefully engineered reward. Social media, same story. Variable rewards, infinite scroll. notifications that promise connection, likes that promise validation, each one a tiny dopamine hit, not enough to satisfy, just enough to keep you hunting. Shopping, eating, pornography, even work if it's compulsive, if it's driven by the need for the next hit, the next achievement, the next high. It's the same mechanism. Dopamine is learning. This behavior led to reward. Do it again. And if the behavior is repeated often enough, it becomes automatic. A habit, then a compulsion, then an identity. I'm a gamer. I'm a workaholic. I'm an emotional eater. These aren't choices anymore. They're loops. And dopamine is the current that keeps them spinning. But here's the thing. Dopamine doesn't know what's good for you. It only knows what felt rewarding. It's a learning system, not a wisdom system, so it will reinforce anything that lights up the pathway. Healthy or harmful. Nourishing or numbing. It doesn't judge. It just amplifies. That means you can use it. You can build loops intentionally. Good habits work the same way bad ones do. The mechanism is identical. You do something, exercise, meditate, read, create, and you feel a small sense of accomplishment. Dopamine marks it. Next time, the behavior comes easier. And if you repeat it consistently, the loop strengthens. Eventually, it becomes automatic. You don't have to force it. Your brain expects it, craves it even. This is neuroplasticity in action. The brain reshaping itself based on what you practice. And dopamine is the sculptor. Every habit you have, good or bad, was built this way. One repetition at a time. One dopamine pulse at a time. The brain learning, always learning, what you care about, what you prioritize, what you are. So if you don't like the loops you're in, you can build new ones. Not instantly, not without effort, but genuinely. Because the same system that trapped you can free you. The same molecule that built the cage can build the bridge. You just have to show it a different path and reward it gently every time you take a step. Dopamine isn't just chemistry. It's architecture. It builds the structure of who you are, your preferences, your habits, your cravings, your aversions. Over time, the pathways you use most become highways. The ones you neglect become dirt roads. And the landscape of your brain, the map of what matters, is written in dopamine. You are, in a very real sense, what you reward. So the question becomes, what are you teaching your brain to love? And is it loving the things you want it to? Let's wander deeper now, past the basics, into the stranger, subtler territories of dopamine's dominion, because this molecule doesn't just control action, it controls perception. It shapes how you see the world, what you notice, what you remember, what you believe is possible. And the more you understand it, the more you realize it's not just influencing your life, it's constructing it. Let's start with something odd. The dopamine paradox. You'd think more dopamine equals more pleasure, more drive, more joy. But it doesn't work that way. There are conditions where dopamine is overactive, and the result isn't euphoria. It's chaos. Mania, for example. In bipolar disorder, during manic episodes, dopamine floods certain pathways. The person feels invincible, full of ideas, bursting with energy. But it's not happiness, it's overwhelm. Thoughts race, sleep vanishes. Impulses become commands. The signal is too loud and the brain can't filter it. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels important. Nothing feels safe. Schizophrenia shows another version. Excess dopamine activity in the mesolimbic pathway is linked to hallucinations, delusions, paranoia. The brain is seeing patterns that aren't there, hearing voices, believing things that aren't true. Why? because dopamine is a pattern detector. It marks what's salient, what's meaningful, but when it's overactive, it starts marking everything. Random noises become messages. Strangers become threats. Coincidences become conspiracies. The signal is so strong, the brain can't distinguish between real meaning and false meaning. Antipsychotic medications work by blocking dopamine receptors, especially D2 receptors. They quiet the signal, but not without cost. Too much blocking, and movement stiffens. Pleasure dulls. Motivation fades. The person is no longer hearing voices, but they're also not feeling much of anything. It's a trade-off, a necessary one sometimes, but a reminder that balance is everything. Too much dopamine, and reality fractures. Too little, and life goes gray. The sweet spot, the place where motivation flows but doesn't overflow, where desire guides but doesn't consume, that's where we want to be. But staying there is harder than it sounds. Let's talk about anticipation, because this is where dopamine reveals its strangest quality. The peak isn't in the having, it's in the wanting. Studies show that dopamine surges highest not when you receive a reward, but in the moments before. The waiting, the hoping, the almost. Think about Christmas morning as a child. The night before, you could barely sleep. The anticipation was electric, but the actual opening of presents? Often a little anticlimactic. The wrapping paper torn, the toys revealed, and somehow the magic dimmed. That wasn't ingratitude. That was dopamine. It peaked in the anticipation and settled in the arrival. This is why bucket list experiences sometimes disappoint. You dream about them for years. You plan, you save, you imagine. Dopamine is firing the whole time. Then you arrive and it's lovely, but it's also just real, just present, just now. And dopamine, which thrives on maybe, starts looking around for the next thing, the next destination, the next dream. It's not that you can't enjoy what you have. It's that dopamine isn't designed for enjoyment. It's designed for pursuit. And pursuit, by definition, is never satisfied. It's always leaning forward, always asking, what's next? This is why rest feels so hard for some people, why vacation days feel uncomfortable, why sitting still can feel like punishment. Because when there's nothing to pursue, dopamine quiets, and in that quiet, some people feel not peace, but panic. A strange emptiness, a void where the chase used to be. We're so used to the hum of wanting that we mistake it for aliveness. And when it stops, we think something's wrong. But nothing's wrong. It's just dopamine settling. And beneath it, beneath the constant forward motion, is something else. Something quieter. Presence, contentment, being. But to access it, you have to stop chasing long enough to notice it's there. Now, let's explore something called incentive sensitization. It's a strange phenomenon where wanting and liking become disconnected. Normally, you want something because you like it. But with incentive sensitization, you keep wanting something even after you stop liking it, even after it stops feeling good. This happens with addiction. The first time someone uses a drug, it might feel amazing. But over time, tolerance builds. The high gets smaller. The pleasure fades. But the wanting doesn't fade. It grows. The brain has learned that this thing is important, and it keeps firing dopamine in anticipation, even when the actual experience no longer delivers. So the person keeps using, not for pleasure, but because the craving is overwhelming. They want it desperately, even though they don't like it anymore, even though it's destroying their life. This separation of wanting from liking is one of the cruelest tricks of dopamine. It keeps you hooked on things that no longer serve you. And it's not just drugs. It happens with relationships. You keep going, back to someone who hurts you, not because you're happy with them, but because your brain has marked them as important. The dopamine fires when you see their name, when you imagine reconciling, when you hope things might be different. The wanting is chemical. The liking is gone. But the loop persists. It happens with jobs. You stay in a career that drains you because you've invested so much, because quitting feels like failure, because some part of you keeps hoping it will get better. The wanting, the attachment, the sense that this matters, it's all dopamine. Even when the joy is long gone, breaking these loops requires awareness. You have to see the pattern, name it, recognize that the wanting isn't evidence that the thing is good for you. It's just evidence that your brain learned to mark it, and what was learned can be unlearned, slowly, with new patterns, new rewards, new pathways. Let's shift now to something unexpected. Dopamine in the gut. Yes, your digestive system also produces and responds to dopamine. Your gut has its own nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, with millions of neurons that regulate digestion, appetite, mood, and dopamine is part of that system. This is one reason why gut health affects mental health, why anxiety causes stomach aches, why depression can kill your appetite or make you crave comfort food, why joy can make you hungry. The gut and brain are in constant conversation, and dopamine is one of the messengers. Emerging research even suggests that gut bacteria, your microbiome, may influence dopamine production, that the trillions of organisms living inside you might play a role in your mood, your motivation, your cravings. It's early science, but the implications are fascinating. You're not just a brain piloting a body, you're an ecosystem, and dopamine is woven throughout. What you eat affects how you feel, not just nutritionally, but neurochemically. Processed foods, high in sugar and fat, create strong dopamine responses. They're designed to. They hijack the reward system the same way drugs do. Your brain learns this is valuable. Get more. But whole foods, complex carbs, proteins, healthy fats, they provide steadier, gentler rewards. They nourish without spiking. They support dopamine production without overwhelming the system. This is why diet matters for mental health. Not because food is medicine in a mystical sense, but because it's chemistry. What you put in your body affects what your brain produces, and what your brain produces affects what you want, what you feel, what you do. Then there's genetics. Some people are born with variations in dopamine receptor genes. The most studied is DRD4, which affects how sensitive your dopamine receptors are. People with certain variants of this gene tend to be more novelty-seeking, more adventurous, more risk-taking. It's sometimes called the explorer gene, though that's oversimplified. It's not destiny. It's a slight tilt, a gentle predisposition. In a supportive environment, this trait might lead to creativity, entrepreneurship, discovery. In a harsh or chaotic environment, it might lead to addiction, impulsivity, instability. The same biology, different outcomes. This is the nature-nurture dance. Your genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And dopamine is part of that dance. Some people naturally have more baseline dopamine. They're energetic, optimistic, driven. Others have less. They're more prone to boredom, depression, low motivation. Neither is better or worse, just different. But modern life, with its constant stimulation, favors the low dopamine brain in some ways, because those brains are always seeking more input, more novelty, more stimulation. They're built for the scroll. High dopamine brains, on the other hand, might get overwhelmed faster. Too much input and they crash. Too much stimulation and they burn out. Again, balance. Knowing your own system. Learning what you need, not what the world tells you to need. Now let's talk about flow. That magical state where time disappears. Where you're so absorbed in an activity that everything else fades. Where effort becomes effortless. Athletes call it the zone. Artists call it inspiration. Psychologists call it flow. And dopamine is part of it. In flow, dopamine releases in steady, moderate waves. Not spikes, not crashes, just a sustained, gentle current. Enough to keep you engaged, focused, motivated. But not so much that you're overstimulated or anxious. This is the system at its best. Not chasing, not craving, just immersed. Flow happens when challenge and skill are balanced. When the task is hard enough to demand your attention, but not so hard that you feel overwhelmed. When you have clear goals, immediate feedback, and a sense of progress. All of these elements feed the dopamine system in healthy ways. You're working towards something. You're seeing results. You're learning, improving, and dopamine is there, quietly marking each small victory, each moment of mastery. This is the dopamine of craft, of practice, of deep work, and it feels different from the dopamine of consumption. It's richer, more satisfying. It doesn't fade as fast, because it's earned, not given, built, not bought. Flow is where dopamine becomes aligned with meaning, where the chemical and the purpose meet, and the result is not just pleasure, but fulfillment. This is what we're all seeking, whether we know it or not. Not more dopamine, better dopamine. Dopamine that serves our growth, not our escape. Dopamine that rewards what we value, not just what feels good in the moment. Let's explore another angle. Dopamine and hope. Because this molecule isn't just about the present, it's about the future, about possibility. When you imagine something good happening, even without evidence, dopamine stirs. It whispers, maybe. What if? Could be. This is why hope is so powerful. Why vision boards work for some people. Why setting goals, even distant ones, can create motivation. Because the brain doesn't always distinguish between what's real and what's vividly imagined. If you picture yourself succeeding, dopamine treats it like a prediction, and predictions trigger dopamine. So you feel a little spark, a little energy. And that energy, if nurtured, can become action. But hope is also dangerous. Because dopamine doesn't know if your hope is realistic. It just knows you're expecting something. So you can get stuck in false hope, waiting for someone to change, believing that next time will be different, returning to situations that keep hurting you, all because the hope, the possibility, the what if, keeps dopamine alive. And as long as dopamine is alive, the loop continues. This is why letting go is so hard, why closure matters, why ambiguity is torturous. Because ambiguity keeps the dopamine system engaged. It says, maybe there's still a chance. Maybe if you wait. Maybe if you try harder. And the brain, desperate for resolution, keeps holding on, keeps hoping. Even when hope is hurting you. Breaking free requires accepting that some things will never give you the reward you're waiting for. That some loops need to be abandoned, not completed. That sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop hoping for what will never come and start hoping for something new. Now, let's touch on something both beautiful and unsettling. Dopamine doesn't just shape your desires, it shapes your reality, because attention is selective. You can't notice everything. Your brain filters. And dopamine is part of the filter. It highlights what matters, what's rewarding, what's worth paying attention to. So two people can look at the same scene and see completely different things. One person sees opportunity. Another sees threat. One sees beauty. Another sees nothing at all. It's not that the scene is different. It's that their dopamine systems are highlighting different aspects. This is why motivation is so personal. What drives one person bores another. What excites one feels empty to another. It's not about better or worse. It's about what your dopamine system has learned to value. And that learning is shaped by everything. Your childhood, your culture, your experiences, your choices. Over time, the patterns harden, the pathways deepen, and your reality, the world you experience, is built by what you've taught your brain to notice. But here's the hope. It's not fixed. Attention can be retrained. You can deliberately practice noticing new things. Gratitude practices, for example, train the brain to notice what's going well. Mindfulness practices train attention to stay present rather than chasing the next thing. Creative practices train the brain to find meaning in subtlety, in process, in the journey rather than the destination. Each of these is a form of dopamine retraining, not by force, but by gentle, consistent redirection. You're showing your brain, this matters too. This is worth noticing. This is rewarding. And, slowly, the system learns. Here's another layer. Dopamine and identity. Because over time, what you do becomes who you are. The athlete who can't imagine a day without training. The artist who feels lost without creating. The parent who finds purpose in nurturing. The listener who finds peace in a quiet voice about molecules just before sleep. These aren't just roles, they're dopamine maps. The brain has learned that these activities are rewarding, meaningful, important, and so they become central to identity. But this cuts both ways. If your identity is built around consumption, around status, around external validation, those become your dopamine maps. You feel rewarded by likes, by promotions, by things, and you organize your life around chasing them. Again, not good or bad, just patterns, but worth examining, because the question is, are these the patterns you want? Are these the rewards that nourish you? Or are you chasing things because they're easy to measure, easy to get, easy to share? Dopamine will follow wherever you lead it, but you have to lead. You have to choose consciously what you want your brain to find rewarding, and then practice, 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 until the new pattern becomes the default, until the new identity feels natural, until what you value and what your brain rewards are aligned. That's freedom. Not the absence of dopamine, but the alignment of it, the harmony between your chemistry and your choice. And that harmony, that's what we're all searching for. Let's step into history now. Trace the arc of discovery. See how humans slowly peeled back the layers of this invisible force. Because dopamine's story is also the story of how we came to understand ourselves, how we moved from myth to mechanism, from poetry to precision. And yet, somehow, the mystery remains. The story begins quietly in 1910. Two chemists, George Barger and James Ewens, were studying compounds related to adrenaline. They isolated a molecule and named it dopamine, based on its structure. Dopa, short for dihydroxyphenylalanine plus amine. It was just a name, just a compound. They didn't know what it did. For decades, dopamine sat in the background, a chemical footnote, unremarkable. Then, in 1957, a Swedish scientist named Arvid Carlsson began experimenting with rabbits. He was studying Parkinson-like symptoms, trying to understand why movement became so difficult in certain conditions. Other researchers had noticed that giving animals L-Dopa, a precursor to dopamine, seemed to restore movement, but no one understood why. Carlson had a hunch. What if dopamine wasn't just a stepping stone to other neurotransmitters? What if it was a neurotransmitter itself? So he gave animals L-Dopa, watched their movement improve, and then used a technique called histofluorescence to trace where dopamine was concentrating in the brain. What he found was revolutionary. Dopamine wasn't scattered randomly. It was clustered in specific regions. The substantia nigra, the ventral tegmental area, and it was projecting to other key areas, the striatum, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex. These were regions involved in movement, motivation, emotion, decision-making. Dopamine wasn't minor. It was central. In 1958, Carlson published his findings. Dopamine was a neurotransmitter, a messenger with its own job. And that job, it seemed, was essential for coordinating movement and regulating mood. The discovery rippled through neuroscience. Suddenly, Parkinson's disease made sense. It wasn't a muscle disorder. It was a dopamine disorder. The neurons that produced dopamine in the substantia nigra were dying, and without dopamine, the signal to move couldn't get through. This led to one of the first major breakthroughs in treating neurodegenerative disease. L-Dopa was introduced as a therapy. Patients who had been frozen, trapped in their own bodies, began to move again. Not cured, but unlocked. The results were so dramatic that neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote about them in his book Awakenings. Patients who had been catatonic for years suddenly came back to life after receiving L-Dopa. They could walk, talk, engage, but the treatment wasn't perfect. Over time, the effects would wear off. The disease would progress, and the dopamine system, once stimulated, would sometimes overshoot, causing involuntary movements, mood swings, even psychosis. It was a reminder that dopamine is a tightrope. Too little, and you can't move. Too much, and you can't stop. For his work, Carlson won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2000. But his discovery was just the beginning. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, researchers began mapping dopamine more precisely. They identified multiple dopamine pathways. They discovered different types of dopamine receptors, D1 through D5, each with different functions and locations. They started connecting dopamine to more than just movement. In the 1970s, the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia emerged. Researchers noticed that drugs which increased dopamine activity could trigger psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, and drugs that blocked dopamine, the first antipsychotics, reduced those symptoms. The conclusion: excess dopamine, particularly in the mesolimbic pathway, might explain the hallucinations and delusions seen in schizophrenia. It wasn't the whole story. Schizophrenia is far more complex. But it was a piece, and it showed that dopamine wasn't just about movement or mood. It was about perception, about meaning, about how the brain decides what's real and what's not. Then came the addiction research. In the 1980s and 90s, scientists began tracing how drugs of abuse affected the brain. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, alcohol, nicotine, all of them, despite being chemically different, had one thing in common. They all increased dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Some did it by blocking reuptake, some by stimulating release, some by mimicking dopamine itself. But the result was the same: a flood of dopamine, a massive reward signal, a lesson burned into the brain. This is the most important thing. Do this again. Addiction, researchers realized, wasn't about moral weakness. It wasn't about lack of willpower. It was about a hijacked learning system, a dopamine system that had been overpowered and couldn't reset. This changed how we thought about addiction. It became a medical issue, not a moral one. A brain disorder, not a character flaw. And it opened the door to new treatments, medications that could modulate dopamine, therapies that could help rebuild reward pathways, support systems that could provide alternative sources of dopamine, connection, purpose, meaning. But the research also revealed something uncomfortable. It wasn't just drugs. Behaviors could hijack dopamine too. In the 1990s, researchers started studying gambling addiction. They found that gambling activated the same reward pathways as cocaine, the same dopamine surges, the same compulsive patterns, the same inability to stop even when losing everything. Why? Because gambling is perfectly designed to exploit dopamine, variable rewards, intermittent reinforcement, near misses that feel like wins. The brain lights up, not because you're winning, but because you might. That uncertainty, that possibility, that's dopamine's sweet spot. And once the pattern is established, it's incredibly hard to break. This understanding expanded. Video games, shopping, eating, sex, social media, even work. If it triggered dopamine, if it created a loop, if it became compulsive, it could become addictive. Not in the same way as heroin, not with the same physical dependence, but in the same neural architecture, the same pathways, the same loss of control. By the 2000s, dopamine had entered popular culture. Books, articles, talks, all explaining how dopamine worked and how it could be manipulated. The phrase dopamine hit became common. Companies started designing products explicitly to maximize engagement by triggering dopamine. Tech companies hired behavioral psychologists to optimize apps for addictiveness. Social media platforms introduced features like infinite scroll, autoplay, notifications, all calibrated to keep dopamine flowing. Sean Parker, an early Facebook executive, later admitted that the platform was designed to exploit a vulnerability in human psychology, to give you a little dopamine hit every time someone liked or commented on your post. The goal wasn't to make you happy. It was to consume as much of your time and attention as possible. And it worked. Average screen time skyrocketed. Rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness increased, particularly among young people who grew up with smartphones. The dopamine system, designed for a world of scarcity, was being overwhelmed by a world of engineered abundance, and we're still figuring out how to adapt, how to protect our attention, how to reclaim our agency, how to build environments that support healthy dopamine function, rather than exploiting it. The story continues today. Researchers are exploring dopamine's role in creativity, curiosity, learning, moral decision-making, even political beliefs. They're finding that dopamine affects not just what we do, but how we think, how we interpret evidence, how we form beliefs, how we relate to uncertainty. There's evidence that people with higher baseline dopamine tend to be more liberal, more open to change, more novelty-seeking. People with lower baseline dopamine tend to be more conservative, more cautious, more drawn to stability. Not a perfect correlation, not deterministic, but a tendency, a tilt. It suggests that even our deepest values, our sense of right and wrong, might be influenced by neurochemistry. Not determined by it, but nudged, shaped, colored. This is both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it means we're not as in control as we think. Empowering because it means we can change. If our beliefs are partly chemical, then changing our environment, our habits, our inputs can shift our chemistry. And shifting our chemistry can open us to new ways of seeing. new possibilities, new versions of ourselves. We're also learning that dopamine is highly sensitive to context. Sleep, stress, diet, exercise, social connection, all of these affect dopamine production and receptor sensitivity. Poor sleep disrupts dopamine signaling, making focus harder and cravings stronger. Chronic stress depletes dopamine, leading to burnout and anhedonia. Isolation reduces dopamine, which is why loneliness feels so heavy, so gray. But connection, real connection, face-to-face, meaningful, restores it. Exercise boosts dopamine, which is why a run or a walk can shift your entire mood. Sunlight increases dopamine production, which is why winter can feel so hard for some people. Even small changes, a walk outside, a conversation with a friend, a night of good sleep, can shift the system. Can restore balance. Can help you feel like yourself again. The future of dopamine research is fascinating. Scientists are exploring whether we'll be able to precisely modulate dopamine pathways with new medications, with brain stimulation techniques, maybe even with gene therapy. The goal isn't to make everyone the same. It's to help people whose systems are out of balance. People with depression, ADHD, Parkinson's, addiction. People who are suffering because their dopamine system isn't working the way it should. But there are ethical questions. If we can adjust dopamine, should we? If we can make someone more motivated, more focused, more driven, where's the line between treatment and enhancement? If a pill could make you enjoy exercise as much as you enjoy scrolling, would you take it? Should you? And who gets to decide what a healthy dopamine system looks like? These aren't easy questions. They're the questions we'll be grappling with for decades. Because dopamine isn't just about feeling good. It's about what we value, what we pursue, who we become. And if we can engineer that, we need to think very carefully about what we're engineering toward. For now, the story of dopamine is still being written by scientists in labs, by designers in tech companies, by individuals making daily choices about what to pursue and what to let go, and by you, right now, listening, learning, becoming aware of the system that's been running in the background all along. That awareness is the beginning of something. Not control, maybe, but participation. A chance to see the machinery and decide how you want to engage with it. A chance to write your own chapter in the dopamine story. So here we are at the crossroads of chemistry and choice, standing in the gap between what is and what could be. Let's wander into speculation now, into the realm of what if, into questions that don't have answers yet, but are worth asking anyway. Because dopamine, for all its precision, all its measurability, still leads us to the edge of mystery, to questions about consciousness, about free will, about what it means to be human. So let's play with possibilities. Let's imagine. What if you could turn dopamine off completely? Just for a day. Flip a switch and silence the molecule of wanting, of seeking, of motivation. What would that be like? At first, you might imagine peace. No cravings. No restlessness. No urge to check your phone, to eat when you're not hungry, to do anything at all. Just pure, empty stillness. But then, nothing moves. You don't get out of bed, not because you're tired, but because there's no reason to. You don't eat, not because you're not hungry, but because eating requires effort, and effort requires motivation, and motivation requires dopamine. You don't speak. You don't think about the future. You don't care about anything. Because caring, all caring, is mediated by dopamine. This isn't hypothetical. There are rare cases, usually from brain damage or extreme medication side effects, where dopamine function is severely impaired. and the result is akinetic mutism. The person is awake, conscious, but completely unmotivated. They can move, they can speak, but they don't. They just sit, staring, empty. It's one of the most disturbing conditions in neurology because the person is there, but also not there. The lights are on, but no one's home. Because home, it turns out, is dopamine. The sense of agency, of wanting, of mattering, all of it depends on this molecule. Now flip it. What if you could turn dopamine up? All the way. Infinite motivation, endless drive, every action rewarded, every moment celebrated. It sounds amazing. You'd be unstoppable. But remember, dopamine isn't the reward. It's the anticipation. So if everything promises reward, nothing feels special. Your brain would adapt. It would downregulate. And soon, you'd need more and more stimulation just to feel baseline. This is what happens in mania. And it's not fun. It's exhausting, overwhelming. The mind racing too fast to catch. The body moving too fast to rest. Ideas flooding in faster than you can process them. And beneath it all, not joy, but desperation, because the system is running too hot and there's no way to turn it down. So the fantasy of infinite dopamine collapses, because balance, again, is everything. What if you could edit your desires? In the not-so-distant future, with CRISPR, with brain-computer interfaces, with precision medicine, it might be possible to adjust your dopamine system, to increase receptors in areas that control focus, to decrease sensitivity in areas that respond to junk food or social media, to fine-tune your reward system like tuning an instrument. Would you do it? Would you pay to make yourself love healthy food as much as you love pizza? To make exercise feel as good as scrolling? To eliminate the craving for things that hurt you? It's tempting, but also unsettling, because if you change what you want, do you change who you are? If your desires are edited, are they still yours? And who decides what the right desires are? This gets even stranger when you consider external control. What if companies, governments, institutions could subtly influence your dopamine system? Not with force, but with nudges. With algorithms that know exactly how to keep you engaged. With environments designed to make certain choices feel rewarding and others feel difficult. Some would say this is already happening. That we're already living in a world where our dopamine systems are being steered by invisible hands, where what we want is shaped by what we're shown, where our attention is sold to the highest bidder. And if that's true, then the question becomes, how do we take it back? How do we reclaim agency over our own reward systems? Maybe the answer is awareness. Maybe it's enough to see the system, to understand how it works, to recognize when you're being manipulated. Not so you can resist every impulse, but so you can choose which impulses to follow. Maybe the answer is environment design, creating spaces, digital and physical, that support the dopamine patterns you want, turning off notifications, curating what you see, building routines that reward the behaviors you value. Maybe the answer is community. Because dopamine doesn't just respond to individual rewards. It responds to social rewards, connection, belonging, being seen, being valued. And those rewards, unlike algorithmic ones, actually nourish. They don't deplete. They restore. Let's imagine another scenario. What if there was a society that understood dopamine, that designed systems to support healthy reward patterns instead of exploiting vulnerable ones? Schools that taught not just information, but attention, how to focus, how to delay gratification, how to find meaning in effort, workplaces that rewarded deep work instead of constant availability, That valued rest as much as productivity. Cities designed for walking, for gathering, for nature, not for endless consumption. Media that informed without outrage, that educated without addiction, that connected without exploitation. It sounds utopian, maybe impossible, but the alternative, the path we're on, is dystopian. A world where attention is the most valuable commodity and everyone is fighting for yours. Where dopamine is weaponized. Where you're not a person, you're a user. And your value is measured in engagement metrics. We don't have to go there. Or rather, we're there now, but we don't have to stay. Because every choice you make, every time you put your phone down, every time you choose the hard thing over the easy thing, every time you build a habit that nourishes instead of numbing, you're voting. You're shaping not just your own dopamine system, but the culture around it. You're saying, this is what I value. This is what matters. This is what I want my brain to learn. And if enough people do that, the culture shifts. The algorithms adjust. The environment changes. Not because anyone forced it, but because we stopped rewarding the wrong things. Now let's get really strange. What if consciousness itself is a dopamine phenomenon? What if awareness, the sense of I, the feeling of being someone, is just a complex pattern of dopamine signaling? Some neuroscientists speculate that consciousness emerged as an evolutionary advantage, a way for the brain to simulate future outcomes, to predict rewards, to plan, and all of that requires dopamine. So maybe the sense of self, the inner voice, the narrator in your head is just your dopamine system talking to itself, trying to figure out what to do next, what to want next, how to get more reward. It's a disturbing thought, because if consciousness is just chemistry, then what are you? Are you the chemistry? Or are you the pattern the chemistry creates? Or are you something else entirely, something that emerges from the chemistry but isn't reducible to it? Philosophers have wrestled with this for centuries, the hard problem of consciousness. How does matter become mind? How do neurons firing become the felt experience of being alive? And dopamine is part of that mystery, because it's not just neurons firing. It's neurons firing in a way that creates meaning, that makes some things feel important and others feel irrelevant, that builds a world, your world, out of chemical signals. Maybe that's as close as we'll ever get to answering the question. You are the meaning your brain creates, the story your dopamine system tells, the pattern that emerges when chemistry becomes choice. But here's the hope in that. If you're the story, then you can rewrite it. Not all at once, not completely, but genuinely. Because stories change, patterns shift. And dopamine, for all its power, is not fixed. It's adaptive, learning, responding. Which means you're not stuck, not trapped, not determined. You're in process, always becoming. And every moment is a chance to teach your brain something new, to show it a different kind of reward, to build a different kind of story. That's the real superpower. Not controlling dopamine, but partnering with it, understanding it, working with its nature instead of against it. Because you can't eliminate wanting. You can't escape the push and pull of desire. But you can choose what to want, what to value, what to pursue. And in that choosing, in that conscious, deliberate practice of steering your attention toward what matters, you become more than your chemistry. You become the author of your chemistry, the director of your own reward system, the architect of your own life. And that is freedom. Not the absence of influence, but the presence of choice. The ability to see the system and decide how you'll respond to it. That's what this whole journey has been about. Not defeating dopamine, but understanding it, befriending it, learning to speak its language so you can guide it toward the life you want to live, the story you want to tell, the person you want to become. Because dopamine will always whisper, will always pull, will always suggest and nudge and promise. But you are the one who listens, the one who decides, the one who chooses what to follow and what to let pass. And in that choosing, you are free. Let's come back down now, from the speculative heights back to the ground of daily life, where dopamine lives not in philosophy but in moments, in choices, in the texture of an ordinary day. Because this isn't abstract, it's happening right now, in your body, in your brain, in the subtle movements of your attention. So let's walk through it. Let's see dopamine in the wild. You wake up. Before you even open your eyes, dopamine is already stirring, rising with the light, preparing your brain for the day. It's part of your circadian rhythm, the biological clock that governs sleep and wakefulness. As morning light hits your eyes, it triggers a cascade. Cortisol rises, dopamine increases. Your brain shifts from sleep mode to action mode. But here's where choice begins. Do you reach for your phone? If you do, you're immediately flooding your dopamine system with novelty. Messages, news, emails, all of it new, all of it uncertain, all of it triggering tiny bursts of maybe. Your brain hasn't even fully woken up, and it's already in pursuit mode, already chasing, already overwhelmed. Or do you let yourself wake slowly? Stretch, breathe, notice the morning. Let dopamine rise naturally, gently, without the spike. This sets the tone for the whole day. Because dopamine has momentum. Start the day chasing, and you'll chase all day. Start the day present, and presence becomes easier to access. Breakfast. If you grab something quick, something sugary, your dopamine spikes fast and crashes hard. 30 minutes later, you're hungry again, irritable, unfocused. But if you eat something balanced, protein, fiber, healthy fats, dopamine rises more slowly and sustains. Your brain has the building blocks it needs: tyrosine, B vitamins, 2. Produce dopamine steadily throughout the day. This isn't about willpower. It's about chemistry. You can't override biology with determination, but you can support it. You can give your brain what it needs to function well. Then work. Maybe you sit down to focus. Maybe you have a task you've been avoiding, and immediately you feel the pull. The urge to check email, to scroll, to do anything but the hard thing in front of you. That's dopamine doing its job. It's calculating which action gives the fastest reward. And the hard task, the one that takes effort and offers distant payoff, loses every time. So you procrastinate. Not because you're lazy, because your dopamine system is optimizing for short-term reward. But here's the thing. You can intervene. You can set a timer. Just 10 minutes on the hard task. That's it. And dopamine, which loves progress, which loves completion, starts to shift. The first few minutes are hard. Your brain is protesting. But as you get into it, as you start to see movement, momentum builds. Dopamine begins to flow, not from distraction, but from the work itself, from the satisfaction of doing what you said you'd do, from the tiny wins that accumulate. This is how discipline is built, not through force, through small, repeated rewards, through teaching your brain that effort pays off, that the hard thing, when done, feels better than the easy thing avoided. Lunch. You're hungry. You have choices. The fast food promises immediate gratification. The salad promises future health. Dopamine tilts toward the burger. But if you've been practicing, if you've been building the loop that says healthy choices feel good, the tilt is gentler, less urgent. You can pause. You can choose the salad. And if you do, if you notice how you feel afterward, clear, energized, satisfied, dopamine marks it. Next time, the choice gets easier because the brain is learning. This works too. This is also rewarding. Afternoon. Energy dips. Dopamine naturally decreases. You feel foggy, unmotivated. This is normal. Your brain isn't designed for constant output. It needs rest. But instead of resting, you reach for coffee, sugar, stimulation. You override the dip. You force the system to keep going. And it works for a while. But the cost is later. Because every time you override your body's signals, every time you stimulate instead of rest, you teach your brain that rest isn't safe, that stopping isn't an option, that you have to keep chasing. Over time, this leads to burnout, to exhaustion, to the sense that you're running on empty but can't stop. So what if instead you honored the dip? What if you took a walk, closed your eyes for 10 minutes, let your brain wander? Dopamine doesn't disappear during rest. It shifts, it consolidates, it processes, it prepares for the next wave of focus. And when you return to work after true rest, you're sharper, clearer, more creative, because you worked with your biology instead of against it. Evening. The day is done. You're tired. And here's where the loops are strongest, because you've been making decisions all day, resisting urges, focusing, performing. And now, decision fatigue sets in. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that plans and inhibits, is exhausted. So dopamine takes over. And it wants easy reward. It wants the couch, the screen, the scroll, the snack. And you give in. Not because you want to, because you're too tired to resist. This is why evenings are so hard, why habits break at night, why you undo all the good choices you made during the day. But there's a way to work with this. Instead of fighting the urge for reward, give yourself a better one. A warm bath, a good book, a conversation with someone you love, a hobby that absorbs you. These things require a little more effort than scrolling, but they offer deeper reward, slower dopamine, the kind that satisfies instead of depleting. And if you can build an evening routine that supports this, that gently guides you toward nourishing rewards, your brain will follow. It will learn. This is what evenings are for. Not escape, but restoration, then sleep. And sleep is where dopamine resets, where the system heals, where memories consolidate and pathways prune. If you've been overstimulating all day, your brain struggles to settle. Dopamine is still firing, still searching, still expecting the next hit. So you lie there, exhausted but wired, scrolling until you finally crash. But if you've been honoring your dopamine system, if you've been giving it real rewards, it settles more easily. It trusts that tomorrow will bring what it needs. So it lets go, and you sleep. Deep, restorative sleep. The kind that allows your brain to repair, to recalibrate, to prepare for another day. This is the cycle. This is how dopamine shapes your life, not just in big decisions, but in 1,000 tiny ones. And the beautiful thing is, you can shape it back, not by controlling it, but by understanding it, by working with it, by recognizing the patterns and gently, patiently building better ones. Let's talk now about relationships, because dopamine doesn't just live in your head, it lives between people, in the space where connection happens. Or doesn't. When you first meet someone, when there's attraction, chemistry, spark, that's dopamine. It's firing like crazy. Every text is exciting. Every meeting feels electric. Every conversation is possibility. This is the honeymoon phase, and it's intoxicating. But it's not love, not yet. It's anticipation. It's uncertainty. It's the thrill of maybe. And dopamine feeds on that. But over time, the uncertainty fades. You get to know the person. The surprises decrease. The novelty wears off, and dopamine settles. For some people, this feels like falling out of love. The spark is gone. The excitement is gone. So they leave. They seek the next hit, the next person who triggers that rush, and they repeat the cycle, never getting past the dopamine phase, never building real intimacy, because real intimacy, long-term love, that's built on something else. Not dopamine spikes, but steady connection, trust, presence, commitment. These things don't give you the high, but they give you something deeper, something that sustains. This is the challenge of modern dating. Apps are designed for dopamine. Swiping is a slot machine. Every profile is a possibility. Every match is a little win. But it keeps you in the hunting phase, in the maybe phase. And it's very hard to transition from that into the being phase, into actually choosing someone and building with them. Because building is slow. It's effort. It's showing up when you don't feel like it. It's working through conflict instead of walking away. And dopamine doesn't reward that. Not immediately. But if you stay, if you practice, if you let the relationship deepen, a different kind of reward emerges. Not excitement, but belonging. Not novelty, but knowing. Not the thrill of the chase, but the peace of having arrived. And that peace, over time, becomes its own reward. Your brain learns, this is good, this is safe, this is home. And dopamine flows differently, gentler, warmer, more like a hearth than a firework. But you have to get there. You have to resist the pull toward the next shiny thing. You have to trust that what you're building is worth more than what you're chasing. This applies to friendships too, to family, to any relationship that matters. Dopamine will always be drawn to new, to exciting, to drama. But nourishment comes from depth, from history, from people who know you and stay. And those relationships, they're built one boring Tuesday at a time, one conversation, one small act of care, one moment of showing up. Dopamine marks those moments too, quietly, and over time, the accumulation becomes something irreplaceable. Let's shift to creativity, because this is where dopamine becomes magic. Every artist, every writer, every musician, every maker knows the feeling, the pull to create, the urge that won't be ignored. That's dopamine. It's saying there's something here, something worth exploring, something that might be good. And you follow it. You sit down. You start. And at first, it's hard. The page is blank. The canvas is empty. The silence is heavy. Your brain resists because creating is uncertain. There's no guarantee of reward. No promise that what you make will be any good. But if you push through, if you keep going, something shifts. You find a rhythm, a flow, and dopamine starts to release, not in spikes, in waves. Each small decision, each problem solved, each line written, is a tiny reward, and they accumulate. The work becomes its own pull. You lose track of time. You forget you're tired. You're not chasing dopamine anymore. You're riding it. This is flow. This is what researchers call optimal experience, the state where challenge and skill meet, where you're stretched but not overwhelmed, where effort becomes effortless, and dopamine is the current that carries you. But here's the paradox. You can't force flow. You can't chase it. The moment you try to capture the feeling, it slips away, because flow requires letting go, trusting the process. focusing on the work, not the reward. And that's hard, because we're trained to optimize for outcome, to measure success, to track your progress. But creativity doesn't work that way. It works through exploration, through play, through making mistakes and learning from them, through following curiosity even when it doesn't make sense. And dopamine supports this, if you let it, if you stop demanding that every moment be productive, if you allow yourself to wander, to try things, to fail, because failure, when reframed, is also a dopamine opportunity. It's information, it's learning. It's the brain figuring out what doesn't work so it can discover what does. This is why process matters more than outcome, why showing up matters more than being brilliant. Because dopamine rewards consistency. It rewards effort. It rewards the act of creation itself, regardless of the result. And over time, that's what builds a creative life. Not talent, not genius, just the willingness to keep showing up, to keep making, to keep following the pull. Let's talk about learning now. Because dopamine is the engine of curiosity. When something interests you, when you wonder how or why, that's dopamine asking questions. And when you find the answer, when the puzzle clicks, dopamine rewards you. This is how we learn. Not through force, through fascination. Children are natural learners because their dopamine systems are wide open. Everything is new. Everything is interesting. Everything is worth exploring. They ask why constantly. They touch everything. They experiment fearlessly. And their brains grow like crazy because dopamine is lighting up pathways, marking what matters, building connections. But somewhere along the way, many of us lose that. School trains us to learn for grades, not curiosity. Work trains us to perform, not explore. And slowly, the joy of learning gets replaced by the obligation to know. Dopamine stops firing for questions and starts firing only for answers, for outcomes, for validation. And learning becomes heavy, boring, something to get through, not something to savor. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can rekindle curiosity. You can retrain your dopamine system to reward the process of learning, not just the result. How? By following what genuinely interests you, not what you think you should learn, not what's practical or impressive, but what lights you up, what makes you wonder, what pulls you in, and then exploring it, not to master it, not to finish it, just to play with it, to see where it leads, to enjoy the unfolding. That's how you rebuild the joy of learning, by letting dopamine do what it does best. Reward curiosity, reward exploration, reward the delicious uncertainty of not knowing yet. And the beautiful thing is, when you learn this way, you remember more, you understand deeper, because the information isn't just stored. It's woven into meaning, into emotion, into story. Dopamine makes it stick. Let's talk about purpose now, because this is where dopamine reaches its highest potential. Purpose is not a feeling. It's a direction, a commitment, a choice to orient your life toward something that matters, not just to you, but beyond you. And dopamine is what fuels that orientation. When you're working on something bigger than yourself, something that contributes, that serves, that builds, dopamine flows differently. It's not about getting, it's about giving. It's not about consuming, it's about creating. And the reward, it's not immediate. It's not flashy, but it's deep, enduring, real. This is the dopamine of meaning, and it's the most sustainable kind. Because it doesn't depend on external validation. It doesn't need likes or applause. It's sourced from within. from the alignment between what you value and what you do, from the sense that your life is pointed in a direction that honors who you are. This is why purpose protects against addiction, against burnout, against despair. Because when you have something that matters deeply, something you're building toward, dopamine has a North Star. It's not just wandering, seeking, hunting. It's oriented, focused, committed, and that focus, that commitment, it becomes its own reward. You don't need constant novelty. You don't need endless stimulation, because you're already engaged, already absorbed, already moving toward something. This is what Viktor Frankl wrote about in Man's Search for Meaning, that those who have a why can bear almost any how, that purpose gives life structure, direction, resilience, and dopamine is part of that. It's the biological mechanism that says, this matters. Keep going, even when it's hard, even when it's slow, even when no one's watching. Keep going, because this is what you're here for. So the question becomes, what's your why? What are you building toward? What matters enough to keep you moving when motivation fades? Not what should matter, not what looks good, but what actually pulls you. What makes you feel alive? What you can't not do? That's your dopamine compass. And if you follow it, if you trust it, it will lead you somewhere worth going. Not to perfection, not to arrival, but to a life that feels like yours. A life that's not controlled by dopamine, but guided by it, shaped with it, built in partnership with it. We're nearing the end now, and if you've stayed with me this long, if you've wandered through all these pathways and possibilities, your brain has been doing something remarkable. It's been learning, not just information, but patterns, connections, meaning. And dopamine has been there the whole time, quietly marking what resonates, what lands, what matters. You might not remember every detail. That's okay. That's not the point. The point is the shift, the subtle recalibration, the new awareness that you're not just living your life. You're learning it, building it, one choice at a time. And dopamine is your partner in that building, not your master, not your enemy, but your ancient, faithful companion, the one who's been with you since birth, the one who will be with you until the end, the one who only wants one thing, for you to keep moving, keep exploring, keep growing, keep living. It doesn't care what you choose. It just wants you to choose, to engage, to matter. And in a strange way, that's beautiful, because it means you're never truly stuck. As long as dopamine is flowing, as long as you're capable of wanting, of hoping, of trying, you're alive, you're in motion, you're becoming. And that, becoming, that endless, imperfect, beautiful becoming, that's what it means to be human. So as we close, I want to leave you with this. You are not your cravings. You are not your impulses. You are not the sum of your dopamine loops. You are the awareness of them, the witness, the one who can see the pattern and choose how to respond. And in that seeing, in that choosing, you are free. Not free from dopamine, but free within it. Free to work with it, to guide it, to teach it what you value, to build a life that feels true. And maybe that's the real lesson, that control was never the goal. Understanding was, partnership was, harmony was. Because you and dopamine, you're in this together. Two systems, intertwined, learning from each other, shaping each other, becoming together. And when you stop fighting, when you stop trying to override or ignore or escape, when you simply work with what is, everything gets easier. Not easy, but easier. The cravings soften, the compulsions loosen, the flatness lifts, and slowly, gently, a new rhythm emerges, one where dopamine flows toward what nourishes, where desire points toward meaning, where the chase becomes a dance, and the dance becomes a life where you're not controlled by your chemistry, but informed by it, guided by it, partnered with it. That's the promise. Not perfection, not transcendence, just this, a little more awareness, a little more choice, a little more freedom. And that is more than enough. So rest now. Let your mind settle. Let the information integrate. Let dopamine do what it does in the quiet. Consolidate. Connect. Prepare. You've learned something tonight. Not just about a molecule, but about yourself, about the invisible forces that shape your days, about the possibility of working with them instead of being worked by them. And maybe, just maybe, tomorrow will be different. Not because you're different, but because you see differently, because you understand the whisper beneath your choices, the pull behind your cravings, the system that's been running the show. And in seeing it, you've already changed it. Because awareness changes everything. Let's take one more walk together. A final, gentle loop through what we've learned, not to recap, but to land. To let the pieces settle into something you can carry with you, something that doesn't just inform, but transforms. We started with a question. Does dopamine control your life? And the answer, as with most important questions, is both yes and no. Yes, because it's there in every decision, every craving, every moment of motivation or resistance. It's shaping what you notice, what you want, what you do. It's writing scripts beneath your awareness, pulling strings you didn't know existed. But also no, because control isn't really the right word. Influence is closer. Suggestion, nudge. Dopamine whispers, but you're the one who listens. It pulls, but you're the one who chooses whether to follow. And that choice, that tiny space between impulse and action, that's where you live. That's where freedom exists. Not in the absence of influence, but in the presence of awareness. We traced dopamine's pathways, from the ancient brain stem to the modern prefrontal cortex, from the reward centers to the movement centers to the planning centers. We saw how it coordinates everything, from the smallest gesture to the largest dream. How it helps you walk and talk and love and learn. How it makes you want to try, to explore, to seek. How it builds habits, good and bad, by marking what matters, by teaching your brain what to repeat. We explored its paradoxes, how it peaks not in satisfaction but in anticipation, how wanting and liking can split apart, how too much is as damaging as too little, how it can trap you in loops or pull you toward growth depending on what you teach it. We looked at history, at how humans have always felt this force, this pull, this mysterious drive, and how we've tried to explain it through myth and metaphor, before finally pinning it down to a molecule. And yet, even now, with all our science, all our scanning and measuring and mapping, the mystery remains. Because knowing how doesn't fully explain why. Why this person craves adventure, while another craves stability. Why this song gives you chills, while another feels nothing. Why you can't stop thinking about that one thing, while someone else barely notices. The molecule is universal, but its expression is utterly personal. Shaped by genes, yes, but also by experience, by memory, by meaning, by the unique story of your life. We wandered into the practical, into the daily dance of dopamine in meals and work and rest and relationships. We saw how every choice either strengthens a loop or weakens it, how every small decision is teaching your brain what to value, And we realized that change isn't about force. It's about consistency, about gently, patiently building new pathways until they become the default. We explored the modern crisis, the engineered environments that hijack dopamine, the screens and feeds and notifications that exploit the very system that kept our ancestors alive. We saw how we're overstimulated and undernourished, how we're drowning in novelty but starving for meaning. And we asked, what do we do? How do we live in this world without being consumed by it? And the answer, imperfect but real, is awareness, is intention, is building pockets of resistance, moments of rest, spaces where dopamine can flow naturally instead of being forced. We dove into speculation, into what-ifs and maybes, into questions about consciousness and free will and identity. We asked what it would mean to edit desires, to live in a dopamine-optimized society, to understand ourselves as patterns of chemistry. And we found not answers, but deeper questions. Better questions. Questions that honor both the science and the mystery. And now, here, at the end, what are you left with? Maybe a sense that you're not as in control as you thought, but also not as helpless. Maybe an understanding that your struggles aren't moral failures. They're biological realities, systems doing what they were designed to do in an environment they weren't designed for. Maybe a recognition that you can work with your biology instead of fighting it. That you can befriend your dopamine system, understand its language, guide it gently toward what you want to become. Maybe a quiet hope that change is possible. That you're not stuck. That every moment is a chance to teach your brain something new. That the loops you're in don't have to be the loops you stay in. Maybe just a softening, a little more compassion for yourself, for your cravings and compulsions and contradictions. Because now you know it's not just you, it's your chemistry. And your chemistry is doing its best with what it's been given. And maybe, just maybe, a sense of wonder that this tiny molecule, invisible, untouchable, has shaped everything. Every human achievement, every work of art, every act of courage, every moment of connection. Dopamine was there whispering, what if? What if you try? What if you reach? What if something beautiful is just ahead? And sometimes it was. And sometimes it wasn't. But the reaching, the trying, the moving forward, that's what made us human. That's what built civilizations and wrote symphonies and sent us to the moon. Dopamine is the molecule of possibility. And possibility is the essence of hope. So what now? What do you do with all this? You don't have to do anything. You don't have to change your life overnight. You don't have to fix every habit or resist every craving or become some perfect version of yourself. You just have to notice. Notice when dopamine is pulling you. Notice what it's pulling you toward. Notice whether that pull is serving you or draining you. And then, gently, kindly, choose. Not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, just a little more often than before. Choose the thing that nourishes over the thing that numbs. Choose presence over pursuit. Choose depth over distraction. Choose the slow reward over the fast hit. And watch what happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time. Watch how the loops shift, how the cravings change, how the pull gets gentler, how life gets quieter, fuller, more yours. That's all this is. A gentle invitation to see yourself more clearly, to understand the forces shaping you, and to partner with them instead of being pushed by them. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're not failing. You're human. And being human means navigating this strange, beautiful, complex system of wants and needs and drives. It means learning to dance with dopamine instead of being danced by it, and you're already doing it. Every time you pause, every time you choose, every time you notice the pull and decide whether to follow, you're already in the dance, already learning the steps, already becoming freer. So as you drift towards sleep, as your eyes get heavy and your thoughts get soft, let all of this settle. Let it integrate. Don't hold on to it. Don't try to remember every detail. Just let it become part of you, part of how you see, part of how you choose, part of how you live. And know that tomorrow, dopamine will still whisper. It will still pull. It will still offer suggestions and possibilities and maybes. But now you'll hear it differently. You'll recognize the voice. You'll understand what it's asking for. And you'll have a choice. Not control, not mastery, just choice. And that choice, repeated, becomes a life. Your life. Not perfect, not controlled, but conscious, intentional, yours. And maybe that's all we can ask for. Not to escape our biology, but to understand it. Not to defeat our chemistry, but to dance with it. Not to eliminate desire, but to direct it toward what truly matters. That's the gift of awareness. That's the power of understanding. That's what happens when you see the system instead of being blind to it. You become a participant instead of a passenger, an author instead of a character, a partner instead of a prisoner. And dopamine, this ancient, faithful molecule, becomes not your master, but your companion, walking with you, learning with you, growing with you, one choice at a time, one moment at a time, one beautiful, imperfect human day at a time. So rest now, dear traveler. Close your eyes. Soften into sleep. Let dopamine do its nighttime work, consolidating memories, pruning pathways, preparing you for tomorrow. You've learned something tonight. Something deep, something true. Not just about a molecule, but about yourself, about the invisible architecture of your choices, about the possibility of partnership with your own biology. And that knowledge, that awareness, it's already changing you, already shaping tomorrow's choices, already opening doors you didn't know were closed. So sleep well, dream gently, and wake knowing that you're not controlled by dopamine. You're guided by it, informed by it, partnered with it. And in that partnership there is freedom, there is choice, there is hope. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. Good night, and thank you for walking this path with me, for giving your attention, your curiosity, your trust. May your dopamine flow toward what nourishes you. May your cravings become clearer. May your choices become freer. And may you wake tomorrow with a little more understanding, a little more compassion, a little more power to shape your own story. The story that dopamine helps write, but that you, always you, get to author. Sweet dreams, and may they be filled with the quiet joy of knowing you're more than your molecules. You're the one who notices them, the one who dances with them, the one who, in noticing, becomes free. But before we truly close, let's linger in this space a little longer, because there are still threads to follow, still corners of dopamine's story worth exploring, still whispers worth hearing. We've touched on so much, but the landscape is vast, and there are pathways we've only glimpsed. Let's wander them now, slowly, gently, as your mind drifts toward sleep. Let's talk about dopamine and time perception, because this molecule doesn't just influence what you want or what you do. It changes how you experience the passage of time itself. Have you ever noticed how time flies when you're having fun? how hours can feel like minutes when you're absorbed in something you love. That's dopamine at work. When your reward system is engaged, when dopamine is flowing steadily, your brain stops counting the seconds. It stops monitoring duration. It just experiences. This is why flow states feel timeless, why creative work can swallow entire afternoons, why conversations with the right person make hours disappear. Dopamine creates what researchers call temporal distortion. The present moment expands, becomes more textured, more real. But the opposite is also true. When dopamine is low, when you're bored or understimulated or waiting for something that never comes, time drags. Minutes feel like hours. The clock becomes an enemy. You check it constantly, hoping for movement, finding none. This is the torture of depression. Not just the absence of joy, but the slowing of time. Days become endless, heavy. Each hour a mountain to climb. Because without dopamine, the brain has no reason to engage, no reason to lose itself, so it watches, it waits, it counts, and the counting makes everything slower. There's also the phenomenon of time collapsing in retrospect. When you look back on a period of intense dopamine stimulation, scrolling, binging, endless novelty, the memories blur together. Nothing stands out, nothing sticks. Because dopamine was firing constantly, marking everything as equally important, which means nothing was truly memorable. So weeks can pass and leave almost no trace. You know you were busy. You know time passed. But you can't quite remember what you did. This is the paradox of constant stimulation. It feels full in the moment but empty in memory. Because memory isn't built on quantity. It's built on salience, on moments that matter, on experiences that stand out from the background. And when everything is stimulating, nothing is salient. The brain can't distinguish signal from noise, so it stores very little. Compare that to a day spent in nature, a long hike, a quiet afternoon by water, a slow meal with friends. Less stimulation, less novelty, but more presence, more depth. And when you look back, those days feel fuller, richer, because dopamine marked the moments that truly mattered. The beauty, the connection, the peace. So if you want time to feel meaningful, if you want your life to accumulate into memory, you need contrast. You need moments of high engagement and moments of rest. Moments of dopamine flow and moments of dopamine quiet. The rhythm creates the texture. The texture creates the memory. And the memory becomes your life. Let's explore dopamine and emotion now, because while dopamine isn't an emotion itself, it's deeply intertwined with how we feel. It colors every emotional experience. When dopamine is high, emotions feel more intense, more vivid. Joy becomes elation. Interest becomes fascination. Even sadness can feel more poignant, more meaningful. Because dopamine amplifies salience. It turns up the volume on experience. But when dopamine is chronically low, emotions flatten. This is called emotional blunting. The world doesn't go dark exactly. It just goes gray. You can recognize that something should make you happy, should make you sad, but you can't quite feel it. There's a distance between you and your emotions, like watching your life through glass. This is common in depression, and it's one of the reasons depression is so hard to describe, because it's not intense sadness. It's the absence of intensity altogether, the inability to feel moved, to feel anything deeply, and it's terrifying. Because if you can't feel, how do you know what matters? How do you make choices? How do you know who you are? Dopamine is also involved in emotional learning. When something makes you feel good, dopamine marks it. When something makes you feel bad, dopamine marks that too. Over time, these markers become emotional associations, automatic responses. You see a person, and warmth floods through you, not because you decided to feel that way, but because dopamine learned that this person equals safety, joy, connection. Or you see a place, and anxiety spikes, not because anything bad is happening now, but because something bad happened there once, and dopamine marked it. These associations can be helpful. They keep you safe. They guide you toward good things and away from harmful ones. But they can also trap you, because dopamine doesn't update easily. It holds on to old patterns. So even when a person is no longer safe, even when a situation has changed, the emotional association persists. The feeling arises before thought can intervene. This is why trauma is so sticky, why phobias are so hard to break, why you can know intellectually that something is safe but still feel afraid, because the dopamine system marked it as dangerous, and that mark runs deep. Therapy works, in part, by creating new dopamine associations, by pairing the old trigger with new outcomes. Safety instead of danger, calm instead of panic, over and over until the new association becomes stronger than the old one. It's slow, it's hard, but it's possible, because dopamine can learn. And if it can learn one pattern, it can learn another. Let's shift to dopamine and decision-making, because every choice you make, from what to eat for breakfast to whether to change careers, is influenced by dopamine's predictions. Your brain is constantly running simulations. If I do this, what reward will I get? How certain am I? How soon will it come? And dopamine is the signal that weights those predictions. When dopamine expects a big reward, you lean toward that choice. When it expects disappointment, you lean away. But here's the problem. Dopamine is terrible at long-term thinking. It evolved in a world where most rewards were immediate. Food now, safety now, connection now. So it heavily discounts future rewards. This is called temporal discounting. A reward that's far away feels much less valuable than a reward that's close, even if the distant reward is objectively bigger. This is why saving money is hard, why starting a diet is hard, why working on a long-term project is hard, because the reward is months or years away, and dopamine barely registers it. But the immediate reward, the donut, the scroll, the procrastination, that dopamine sees clearly. So it pulls you toward the short-term option, even when you know the long-term option is better. The key to overcoming this isn't willpower. It's making the long-term reward feel closer, more real, more vivid. Visualization helps. If you can imagine the future reward in detail, if you can feel it, dopamine starts to respond. Goal setting helps. Breaking a big, distant goal into small, near goals gives dopamine something to work with. Each small win releases a little dopamine, and the path forward becomes clearer. Accountability helps. Knowing someone will check in with you creates a near-term social reward, which dopamine values highly, and environment helps. If you remove the immediate temptations, if you make the good choice the easy choice, dopamine has less to fight against. The friction decreases. The decision becomes simpler. This is why people who are good at achieving long-term goals aren't necessarily more disciplined. They're just better at structuring their environment and their mindset to work with dopamine instead of against it. They understand the system, and they use it. Now, let's talk about dopamine and social media in more depth, because this is where modern life and ancient biology collide most dramatically. Social media platforms are dopamine delivery systems. They're not designed to make you happy. They're designed to keep you engaged, and engagement is created through unpredictability, through variable rewards, through the constant possibility that the next post, the next swipe, the next refresh might be the one that delivers. Every time you open an app, dopamine surges in anticipation, not because you know you'll find something good, but because you might. And that possibility is intoxicating. The feed never ends. There's always more. So the anticipation never resolves. You keep scrolling, keep searching, keep hoping. And each little reward, a funny video, an interesting article, a message from a friend, it's just enough to keep the hope alive, to keep the dopamine flowing, but never quite enough to satisfy. This is called a dopamine drip, a steady, low-level stimulation that keeps you engaged but never fulfilled. It's the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive, and it's devastatingly effective. The average person now spends hours a day on social media, not because they're enjoying it. Often they're not, but because they can't stop. The dopamine loop has taken over, and here's what makes it worse. Social media doesn't just exploit dopamine. It hijacks your social reward system. Humans evolved to care deeply about what others think, about belonging, about status, about being valued by the tribe. Because in our evolutionary past, being excluded could mean death. So our brains are wired to monitor social feedback constantly, to adjust behavior based on how others respond. In a small tribe, this worked. You could read faces, have conversations, build real relationships. But social media takes that system and distorts it. Now, you're monitoring feedback from hundreds or thousands of people, most of whom you don't know, most of whom don't matter to your actual survival or well-being. But your dopamine system doesn't know that. It treats every like as social validation, every comment as connection, every follow as acceptance. So you post, and you wait. And when the likes come in, dopamine fires. When they don't, anxiety spikes. And slowly, subtly, your sense of self becomes dependent on metrics, on numbers, on the approval of strangers. This is why social media is linked to rising rates of anxiety and depression, especially in young people. Because the reward is unstable, unpredictable, never quite enough. And the cost is your attention, your time, your sense of reality. Worse, social media trains you to perform, to curate, to present a version of yourself that maximizes engagement. And over time, the performance becomes exhausting. You lose touch with who you are beneath the metrics. You start to feel like a product, a brand, a collection of data points. And dopamine, which should be guiding you toward genuine connection, is instead trapped in a loop of shallow validation. The solution isn't to demonize technology. It's to use it consciously, to recognize when you're being pulled into a dopamine loop, to set boundaries, to choose depth over breadth, quality over quantity, to remember that real connection, the kind that actually nourishes, happens in presence, in vulnerability, in time spent without metrics, and that the dopamine hit of a like is not the same as the dopamine warmth of being truly seen. Let's explore dopamine and music now, because music is one of the most powerful dopamine triggers we have, and it's been with us for as long as we've been human. When you listen to music you love, dopamine floods your brain, especially in moments of anticipation and release. The build before the chorus, the pause before the drop, the moment when the melody resolves. These are dopamine's favorite patterns: tension and release, expectation and fulfillment. But music does something unique. It creates emotional resonance without words. It bypasses logic and speaks directly to feeling. A song can make you cry, make you dance, make you remember something you'd forgotten, all through pure sound. And dopamine is the translator. It's marking the moments that move you, creating associations, building memories. This is why certain songs are so powerful. Why you can hear a song you haven't heard in years and suddenly be back in that moment, feeling what you felt, remembering who you were. Because dopamine tagged it, wove the music into your emotional memory, stored it in a way that's more visceral than thought. Music also has the power to regulate dopamine. When you're anxious, certain music can calm you. When you're sad, certain music can comfort you. When you're unmotivated, certain music can energize you. Because rhythm, melody, harmony, they all influence brain chemistry. They guide dopamine flow. This is why people create playlists for different moods, why music therapy works, why a song can change your entire state in 3 minutes. It's not magic, it's neurochemistry. And it's one of the most accessible tools we have for working with our dopamine systems. You don't need a prescription. You don't need training. You just need to pay attention to how music makes you feel and choose accordingly. Let's talk about dopamine and exercise now, because movement is medicine for the dopamine system. When you exercise, especially aerobic exercise, your brain produces more dopamine, not just in the moment but over time. Regular exercise increases dopamine receptor density. It makes the system more sensitive, more responsive, more balanced. This is why exercise is one of the most effective treatments for depression, for ADHD, for addiction. It doesn't just make you feel better temporarily. It restructures the system. There's something called runner's high, that euphoric feeling that comes after sustained exercise. For a long time, it was attributed to endorphins, but research now shows that dopamine plays a major role too, along with endocannabinoids, which are the brain's natural cannabis-like chemicals. The combination creates a state of effortless flow, of pleasure without craving, of energy without anxiety. And if you exercise regularly, your brain learns to associate movement with reward. So instead of dreading the gym, you start to crave it. Not because you're disciplined, because your dopamine system has been retrained. This doesn't happen overnight. The first few weeks are hard, because the immediate discomfort outweighs the distant reward. But if you push through, if you show up consistently, the loop starts to flip. The discomfort decreases, the reward increases, and eventually, movement becomes something your brain wants, not something you have to force. This is the power of habit, of rewiring, of teaching dopamine a new language. Exercise also does something else. It provides a healthy outlet for dopamine's drive for challenge and achievement. Instead of chasing likes or levels or wins in artificial environments, you're chasing real physical improvement, strength, endurance, skill, and those improvements are tangible, measurable, earned. So the dopamine reward feels different. It feels more solid, more satisfying, because it's rooted in your actual body, your actual capacity, not in pixels or numbers that could vanish tomorrow. Let's discuss dopamine and sleep more deeply, because sleep is where the dopamine system resets, where balance is restored. When you don't sleep enough, dopamine regulation gets disrupted. The receptors become less sensitive. The production becomes erratic. And the result is that you crave more stimulation to feel normal. Caffeine, sugar, novelty, anything to spike dopamine because the baseline is too low. This creates a vicious cycle. Poor sleep leads to low dopamine. Low dopamine leads to poor choices. Poor choices lead to worse sleep. And the spiral continues. But the reverse is also true. When you sleep well, when you give your brain the rest it needs, dopamine systems stabilize, cravings decrease, focus improves, mood lifts, not because you're suddenly more disciplined, but because the system has what it needs to function. Sleep also consolidates the dopamine learning that happened during the day. The pathways you used get strengthened, the ones you didn't get pruned. This is how habits solidify, how skills develop, how memory becomes permanent. So if you're trying to change a pattern, if you're building a new habit, sleep is not optional. It's essential. Without it, the new pathway won't stick. The old pattern will keep reasserting itself, and you'll feel like you're starting over every day. This is one reason why sleep deprivation is used as torture. Not just because it's physically painful, but because it erodes the sense of self. It disrupts the dopamine systems that create motivation, hope, continuity. The person loses the ability to imagine a future, to care about anything, to feel human. So if you take nothing else from this, take this. Protect your sleep. Make it sacred. Turn off screens an hour before bed. Keep your room dark and cool. Go to bed at the same time. Let your dopamine system rest, and watch how everything else gets easier. Let's explore dopamine and nature now, because there's something about natural environments that restores dopamine balance in a way nothing else does. When you spend time in nature, away from screens, away from notifications, away from the constant hum of civilization, your nervous system shifts. Dopamine stops spiking and crashing. It settles into a gentler rhythm. This is called attention restoration theory, the idea that nature provides a form of effortless attention. You don't have to work to focus. The environment guides your attention naturally. A bird's song, light through leaves, water moving. These things are inherently interesting, but not demanding. They engage dopamine without exhausting it. Cities, on the other hand, require constant directed attention. You have to filter out noise, ignore distractions, navigate crowds, make decisions, and all of that depletes the dopamine system, makes it harder to focus, harder to rest, harder to feel okay. But nature doesn't ask anything of you. It just is. And in that just being, your system resets. This is why people report feeling calmer after a walk in the park, why forest bathing is a recognized therapy in Japan, why nature retreats are so powerful. It's not mystical. It's neurochemistry. The dopamine system is getting a break from overstimulation, and in that break, it heals. Interestingly, even images of nature can have a mild dopamine regulating effect. Studies show that looking at pictures of trees, water, landscapes, even for a few minutes, can reduce stress and improve focus. It's not as powerful as actually being there, but it's something. Your brain recognizes the patterns, responds to the cues, and relaxes just a little. So if you're stuck inside, if you can't get to nature, bring it to you. A plant on your desk, a photo of a forest, a recording of rain or ocean waves. These small things matter, because dopamine is always listening, always learning, always adjusting based on what you show it. Let's talk about dopamine and aging now, because as we get older, the dopamine system changes. Dopamine production decreases. Receptor density decreases. The system becomes less responsive. This is one reason why older adults often report feeling less motivated, less interested in new things, less excited by novelty. It's not that they've lost their curiosity. It's that the chemical system that drives curiosity is quieter. But this isn't inevitable. It's not a fixed decline, because the brain remains plastic throughout life, and dopamine systems can be maintained, even strengthened, with the right inputs. Learning new skills is one of the most powerful ways to keep dopamine healthy. When you challenge yourself to learn something difficult, something that requires focus and practice, dopamine pathways are activated. Mistakes become feedback. Progress becomes reward. And the system stays engaged. This is why people who keep learning, who stay curious, who try new things, tend to age better cognitively and emotionally. Not because they're exceptional, because they're keeping their dopamine systems active. Social connection also protects dopamine as we age. Loneliness accelerates dopamine decline. But regular meaningful interaction, time with friends, family, community, it supports dopamine production, keeps the social reward system engaged, gives the brain reasons to care. Physical activity, as we discussed, is crucial too. It's one of the few interventions that actually increases dopamine receptor density, even in older brains. And purpose, meaningful work or contribution, even in small ways, it orients dopamine toward something larger, keeps it from collapsing inward. So aging doesn't have to mean dopamine decline. It can mean dopamine maturity, a shift from chasing novelty to savoring depth, from seeking stimulation to appreciating subtlety, from breadth to focus. That's not loss, that's evolution. Let's discuss dopamine and spirituality now, because across traditions, across cultures, humans have developed practices that, whether they knew it or not, work with dopamine. Meditation is one. When you meditate, especially mindfulness meditation, you're training your attention to rest in the present, to notice sensations, thoughts, feelings without chasing them. And in doing so, you're teaching dopamine a new pattern, not pursuit, not anticipation, just presence. At first, this is incredibly difficult, because dopamine is used to chasing. It wants to solve, to fix, to get somewhere. But as you practice, the system learns. It discovers that presence itself can be rewarding, not in a big, flashy way, but in a quiet, steady way. And over time, that quiet reward becomes more satisfying than the loud ones. This is why long-term meditators often report less craving, less restlessness, less need for external stimulation. Their dopamine systems have been retrained. They've learned to find reward in stillness. Gratitude practices work similarly. When you deliberately notice and appreciate what you have, you're training dopamine to value the present, to see abundance instead of lack, to mark what's here instead of what's missing. And the more you practice, the more automatic it becomes. Prayer, in many traditions, serves a similar function. It orients dopamine toward meaning, toward connection to something larger, toward values that transcend immediate reward. And that orientation, that sense of being part of something beyond yourself, it provides a kind of dopamine that doesn't fade, that doesn't require escalation. Service is another spiritual practice that works beautifully with dopamine. When you help others, when you contribute without expecting return, dopamine fires. Not in anticipation of what you'll get, but in response to the act itself. This is called the helper's high. And it's real, because humans are wired for reciprocity, for community, for mattering. And when you serve, you're activating those ancient circuits. You're telling dopamine, this is what we're here for. And it responds. Fasting, another spiritual practice across traditions, it temporarily resets dopamine sensitivity. When you abstain from food, from pleasure, from stimulation, the system recalibrates. Small things become more rewarding. A simple meal tastes incredible. A quiet moment feels profound. You remember what enough feels like. This isn't about deprivation. It's about reset. About teaching the system that abundance doesn't require constant consumption. That satisfaction is possible with less. These practices aren't about suppressing dopamine. They're about refining it, directing it, aligning it with what you deeply value. And in that alignment, there's a kind of peace that no amount of external reward can provide. Let's explore dopamine and trauma now, because trauma doesn't just create emotional scars, it rewires dopamine circuits. When something terrifying happens, when you're in a state of extreme threat, dopamine surges. It marks the moment, the people involved, the place, the sounds, the smells, everything, and it marks them not just as important, but as dangerous. This is survival. Your brain is learning. Avoid this. Remember this. Never again. But the problem is, dopamine doesn't know when the threat is over. It holds the pattern. So even years later, even in safety, those triggers can activate the dopamine fear circuit. And suddenly, you're back there. Not in memory, but in body, in feeling, heart racing, breath shallow, fight or flight. This is PTSD, a dopamine system that's stuck in alarm, that can't turn off, that sees danger everywhere. Healing requires gently teaching dopamine new associations. This is what trauma therapy does. Through exposure, through processing, through creating new experiences, you show the brain, this is safe now, this is different, you're okay. It's slow, because dopamine holds tight to survival patterns. But it's possible, because the brain can learn, and what was learned can be updated. Trauma also often leads to addiction, because substances or behaviors that spike dopamine can temporarily override the fear circuit. They provide relief, escape, a moment of not feeling, but of course, they don't heal the underlying pattern. They just mask it. And in the process, they create a new dependency, a new dopamine loop. So healing from trauma isn't just about processing the past. It's about rebuilding healthy dopamine patterns in the present, finding rewards that don't harm, building safety that the body can feel, creating a life where dopamine flows toward connection, not escape. This is hard work, some of the hardest work a human can do. But it's sacred work, because it's reclaiming yourself, reclaiming your dopamine, reclaiming your capacity to feel safe in the world. Let's talk about dopamine and language now, because the words we use shape our dopamine patterns more than we realize. When you say, I have to do this, dopamine resists, because have to implies obligation, lack of choice, and the brain doesn't like that. But when you say, I choose to do this, or I want to do this, dopamine engages, because choice implies agency, and agency activates the reward system. This might seem like semantics, but it's not. The brain listens to the stories you tell, and it adjusts accordingly. Similarly, when you use negative framing, don't forget, don't fail, don't mess up. Dopamine struggles. Because it's oriented toward approach, not avoidance. It's better at moving toward reward than away from punishment. But when you use positive framing, remember this. Succeed at this, do this well, dopamine has something to work with, a target to aim for, a reward to anticipate. The language you use with yourself matters. Are you constantly criticizing, shaming, focusing on what's wrong? If so, you're training dopamine to expect punishment, to see yourself as a problem, and that makes motivation almost impossible. But if you can shift the internal dialogue, if you can speak to yourself with encouragement, with recognition of effort, with compassion for struggle. You're training dopamine to support you instead of sabotage you. This isn't toxic positivity. It's not pretending everything is fine. It's strategic framing. It's using language in a way that works with your biology. Because your dopamine system doesn't know the difference between true and false. It just knows what you repeat, what you reinforce, what you mark as important. So if you keep telling yourself you're lazy, undisciplined, broken, guess what dopamine learns? That's who you are. And it stops trying to help. But if you tell yourself you're learning, growing, practicing, dopamine has hope. It has a reason to keep engaging, to keep building pathways, to keep trying. Words create worlds, especially the words you say to yourself. Let's discuss dopamine and money now, because our relationship with money is deeply intertwined with dopamine. Money is an abstract reward. It has no intrinsic value, but your brain treats it as incredibly important. Why? Because money is a placeholder for all other rewards. It represents food, shelter, safety, status, freedom, possibility. So dopamine responds to money the way it responds to any reward. It wants more. And here's where it gets tricky. Because unlike food, where you get full, or sleep, where you pass out, money has no natural satiation point. You can always want more. Always feel like it's not enough. This is why wealthy people often aren't happier than middle-class people. Because the dopamine system adapts. What felt like abundance yesterday becomes baseline today. And the goalpost moves. Again. And again. This is called the hedonic treadmill. And it's exhausting. But understanding it gives you power. Because you can step off. You can decide what enough means for you, not based on what others have, but based on what actually makes your life better. And research shows that beyond a certain point, more money doesn't increase well-being. What increases well-being is how you spend it. Experiences over things, time over stuff, connection over status. These are the purchases that create lasting dopamine satisfaction, not because they're expensive, because they're meaningful. There's also the dopamine of earning versus spending. Earning money, especially through work you value, provides a different kind of dopamine than spending it. Earning is tied to effort, competence, contribution. It reinforces identity. But spending, especially impulsive spending, provides a quick hit followed by regret, because the anticipation is better than the having. The click is better than the delivery. So if you find yourself shopping when you're sad or bored or stressed, you're using spending as a dopamine band-aid. And like all band-aids, it doesn't heal the wound. It just covers it. Better to ask, what am I really craving? Connection, achievement, rest, and then give yourself that directly. Let's explore dopamine and parenting now, because raising children is one of the most dopamine-intense experiences humans have. When you look at your child, when they smile at you, when they learn something new, when they need you, dopamine floods your system. This is bonding. This is love. This is biology ensuring you'll care for this helpless creature for years. But it's also exhausting, because children are unpredictable. The reward schedule is variable. Sometimes they're delightful. Sometimes they're impossible. And your dopamine system is constantly trying to figure out the pattern, which there isn't one. Because they're learning too. They're testing. They're changing, so your brain is in a constant state of alert, constantly adjusting, constantly responding. This is why parenting is so depleting, not just physically, but neurochemically. Your dopamine system is working overtime. And yet, it's also one of the most meaningful uses of dopamine, because you're not chasing abstract rewards. You're building a human. And every moment of patience, every choice to show up tired, every time you regulate your own emotions so you can help them regulate theirs, it's building their dopamine system too. Children learn how to manage dopamine by watching you. If you model patience, they learn patience. If you model delayed gratification, they learn it. If you model finding joy in small things, they learn that too. But if you model constant distraction, constant stimulation, constant impatience, they learn that instead. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being aware, about recognizing that your dopamine patterns become their dopamine patterns. And that's a sacred responsibility. It's also why self-care isn't selfish when you're a parent. It's essential, because if your dopamine system is depleted, if you're running on empty, you can't teach regulation. You can't model balance. You can only survive. And survival mode teaches survival mode. So rest. Recharge. Let your system reset. Not because you deserve it, though you do. Because your children need you to. They need to see that it's possible to care for yourself, to honor your limits, to find reward in rest. That's one of the most important lessons you can teach. Let's talk about dopamine and grief now, because loss disrupts dopamine in profound ways. When someone you love dies, or leaves, or changes, your brain loses a major source of dopamine. All the moments of connection, all the shared experiences, all the anticipated future together, gone. And dopamine doesn't know what to do with that. It keeps firing in anticipation, keeps looking for the person, keeps expecting them to be there. This is why grief feels so physical, why you keep reaching for your phone to text them, why you turn to tell them something and they're not there. It's not just emotional. It's dopamine patterns that haven't caught up to reality. Over time, the system learns. The pathways prune. The anticipation fades. But it's slow and it's painful, because you're not just losing the person. You're losing all the dopamine associations tied to them. The places you went, the things you did, the version of yourself you were with them. Grief rewrites your dopamine map. And while you're rebuilding, nothing feels quite right. Foods don't taste the same. Activities don't interest you. The world feels muted, because dopamine is recalibrating, learning what matters now, what rewards are still available, what's worth pursuing. This is why people say grief comes in waves, because the dopamine system is still learning, still adjusting. Some days it forgets, and you feel okay. Then something triggers the old pattern, the old anticipation, and the loss crashes in again. Not because you're broken, because you're learning. And learning is never linear. The way through isn't to avoid the pain. It's to let the system update, to create new dopamine sources, new connections, new meanings. Not to replace what was lost, nothing can, but to rebuild a life that includes the loss, that honors it, that moves forward anyway. This is resilience, not bouncing back, but growing around. Let's discuss dopamine and technology more broadly now, because we've talked about social media, but it's bigger than that. Every device, every app, every notification is engineered to capture dopamine. Your phone is the most addictive object ever created, not because it's evil, but because it's effective. It has thousands of the world's smartest people working to make it more engaging, more irresistible, more essential to your life. And they're succeeding. The average person now checks their phone 96 times a day. That's once every 10 minutes while awake. Each check is a little dopamine loop, a moment of anticipation. Will there be something new, something important, something interesting? Usually there isn't, but occasionally there is, and that occasional reward keeps the loop alive. This is intermittent reinforcement. Again, the most addictive pattern in existence, and your phone delivers it better than anything else. But here's what's insidious. You don't notice it happening, because each check feels like a choice. You tell yourself you're just quickly checking something. But you're not. You're feeding a dopamine loop. You're training your brain that this is where reward lives. And over time, your brain stops looking elsewhere. Why go for a walk when you could scroll? Why read when you could watch? Why have a slow conversation when you could have 10 fast ones? The phone becomes the easiest, fastest, most reliable source of dopamine, and everything else pales in comparison. This is called opportunity cost. Every moment spent on your phone is a moment not spent building other dopamine pathways, deeper ones, real ones that actually nourish. So what do? You can't just delete everything. You can't opt out entirely. Technology isn't going away. But you can be intentional. You can recognize the loops. You can set boundaries. You can turn off notifications, all of them. Nothing is so urgent it can't wait an hour. You can put your phone in another room, especially at night, especially during meals, especially during conversations. You can create phone-free times, mornings, evenings, weekends, times when you're unreachable. And you can notice the discomfort when you do this, the pull, the urge, the sense that you're missing something. The discomfort is dopamine craving its loop. And if you can sit with it, if you cannot give in, the craving fades. The system adjusts. And you remember what it felt like to be present, to be here, to exist without constantly checking. That memory is worth protecting. Because once the dopamine system learns that presence is rewarding too, everything changes. The phone stops being a master and becomes a tool. Something you use, not something that uses you. Let's explore dopamine and culture more now, because different cultures have different dopamine landscapes. In the West, especially America, dopamine is celebrated. More is better. Ambition is virtue. Hustle is identity. Constant growth, constant achievement, constant optimization. The cultural narrative is all about maximizing dopamine. Reach higher. Want more. Never settle. This creates a population of high achievers and high anxiety, because the dopamine system never rests. There's always another goal, another milestone, another version of success, just out of reach. And no matter what you achieve, it's never quite enough, because enough doesn't exist in a dopamine-maximizing culture. But other cultures frame it differently. In many Eastern philosophies, the goal isn't to maximize desire. It's to minimize it, to find contentment in simplicity, to recognize that craving itself is the problem. This isn't about being lazy or unmotivated. It's about directing dopamine differently, toward depth instead of breadth, toward being instead of becoming, toward enough instead of more. The Danish concept of hygge captures this. The idea of cozy contentment, small pleasures savored, warmth, light, simple food, good company, nothing extravagant, nothing Instagram-worthy, just enough. And in that enough, a kind of dopamine satisfaction that doesn't require escalation. The Japanese concept of ikigai is similar, a reason for being that comes from the intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. Not chasing every passion, not maximizing every talent, but finding the sweet spot and residing there contentedly. These aren't better or worse than Western approaches. They're just different dopamine philosophies, different answers to the question of what makes a good life. And increasingly, people in the West are realizing that the maximizing approach has costs: burnout, anxiety, disconnection, the sense that you're always running but never arriving. So they're looking east, trying meditation, simplifying, minimizing, seeking enough. This isn't cultural appropriation. It's cultural cross-pollination. It's recognizing that dopamine patterns aren't fixed. They're learned. And if they're learned, they can be relearned. You can choose which philosophy to orient around, which story to tell yourself about what makes life good, and your dopamine will follow. Let's talk about dopamine and seasons now, because the changing seasons affect dopamine production in ways most people don't realize. In spring and summer, when daylight is abundant, dopamine production increases. You naturally have more energy, more motivation, more interest in being social, in being active, in starting new things. This is why spring feels like renewal, why summer feels expansive. Your dopamine system is literally brighter. But in fall and winter, especially in places far from the equator, daylight decreases, and with it, dopamine production drops. This is seasonal affective disorder, not just sadness about gray days, but a real neurochemical shift. Your dopamine system is running on less fuel, so everything feels harder. Getting out of bed, focusing on work, enjoying things you normally love. It's not laziness. It's chemistry responding to light. The solution isn't to fight it. It's to work with it. Light therapy helps. Sitting in front of a bright light for 20 minutes each morning can signal to your brain that it's still worth making dopamine. Exercise helps even more, because it boosts dopamine production regardless of season. And lowering your expectations helps too. Recognizing that winter isn't meant for the same pace as summer, that rest is part of the cycle, that hibernation isn't failure, it's adaptation. Different seasons require different dopamine strategies, and if you can honor that, if you can adjust your rhythm to the light, you work with your biology instead of against it. Let's explore dopamine and cooking now, because the act of cooking is a perfect dopamine activity. It has clear goals, immediate feedback, a tangible reward at the end, and it engages all the senses. When you chop vegetables, dopamine rewards the progress. When you smell garlic sizzling, dopamine marks it as good. When you taste and adjust, dopamine is learning. And when you sit down to eat what you made, dopamine celebrates completion. This is why cooking can be meditative. Why it can shift your entire mood. You're giving your dopamine system a healthy, structured way to engage, with clear steps, clear outcomes, clear rewards. Compare that to scrolling, which has no clear goal, no completion, no tangible outcome. Just an endless stream of maybe something good. Cooking has an arc, a story, a beginning, middle, and end. And dopamine loves stories. Plus, when you cook for others, when you feed people, the social dopamine amplifies the reward. You're not just completing a task. You're nurturing, contributing, mattering. And if you eat together, if you share the meal, the dopamine compounds, because you're experiencing both the achievement of making something and the connection of sharing it. This is why family dinners matter, why food traditions matter. They're not just about nutrition. They're about dopamine patterns that reinforce belonging, contribution, and care. So if you're feeling disconnected, if your dopamine system is scattered, try cooking. Not complicated, not perfect. Just something simple, from scratch, with attention, and notice how it feels. To create something real, with your hands, for your body, that exists in the world, that's a different kind of dopamine, and your brain will remember it. Let's discuss dopamine and forgiveness now, because holding on to resentment is a dopamine trap. When you've been hurt, when someone has wronged you, your dopamine system marks them as dangerous. Every time you think about them, you get a little hit of anger, of righteousness, of being right. And that hit, as unpleasant as it feels, is still a dopamine signal. Your brain is saying, this matters. Remember this. Stay angry. Because staying angry feels like protection. But it's not. It's a loop. A pattern that keeps you tethered to the person who hurt you. They may have moved on, but you're still giving them space in your dopamine landscape, still letting them trigger your reward system, still organizing your emotional life around what they did. Forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about releasing yourself from the dopamine loop. It's about saying, I'm not going to keep feeding this pattern. I'm not going to keep giving this energy. I'm choosing to mark something else as important. This doesn't happen all at once. You can't force forgiveness, but you can practice redirecting. When the anger arises, when the dopamine fires, you notice it, you name it, and you choose not to follow it, not to rehearse the story, not to feed the loop. And gradually, the dopamine learns, this isn't important anymore. This isn't where we're putting our energy. And the anger loosens, not because you decided to forgive, but because you stopped rewarding the anger with attention. Forgiveness is a dopamine shift, from punishment to release, from holding on to letting go, and it's one of the most freeing things you can do. Not for them. For you, let's talk about dopamine and boredom now, because boredom is deeply uncomfortable for the dopamine system. When nothing is happening, when there's no stimulation, no novelty, no reward on the horizon, dopamine signals distress. Do something. Find something. Fix this. And in the modern world, we do. We reach for the phone, turn on the TV, find a snack, anything to escape the discomfort of boredom. But boredom isn't the enemy. It's the space where creativity lives, where new ideas emerge, where the brain finally has time to wander, to connect, to discover. When you're constantly stimulated, your brain never gets bored, but it also never gets to rest, never gets to integrate, never gets to just be. Boredom is a signal that you have the space to think, to wonder, to create something from nothing. And if you can sit with it, if you can resist the urge to fill it immediately, something interesting happens. The discomfort passes, and beneath it, there's curiosity, there's imagination, there's the quiet hum of your own mind, uninterrupted. Children used to experience this all the time. Long car rides, waiting rooms, rainy afternoons with nothing to do. And in that boredom, they invented games. They daydreamed. They discovered what interested them. But now, every moment of potential boredom is filled. Screens in the car, tablets in waiting rooms, entertainment on demand, always. So children don't learn to tolerate boredom. They learn to fear it, to see it as something wrong, something to fix immediately, and they lose the capacity for self-generated joy, for internal reward, for dopamine that doesn't come from a device. Adults are the same. We've forgotten how to be bored, and in forgetting, we've lost access to a whole realm of dopamine, the dopamine of creation, of imagination, of building something from the raw materials of your own mind. So practice boredom. Deliberately, sit with nothing. No phone, no book, no music, Just you and your thoughts. It will be uncomfortable at first. Dopamine will protest. But if you stay, you'll discover something. You're more interesting than you thought. Your mind is more creative than you realized. And the dopamine that comes from internal generation, from making something from nothing, is different. Deeper. More yours. Let's explore dopamine and gratitude more deeply now. Because gratitude is one of the most powerful dopamine retraining tools we have. When you practice gratitude, when you deliberately notice and appreciate what you have, you're teaching dopamine to value presence over pursuit, to see abundance instead of scarcity, to mark what's here as enough. At first, this feels forced, because your dopamine system is trained to look forward, to scan for what's missing, to focus on problems. But if you practice daily, if you write down 3 things you're grateful for, if you really feel the appreciation, something shifts. Dopamine starts responding to the good that's already here, to the meal you ate, the roof over your head, the person who smiled at you, the body that carried you through the day. These aren't huge rewards. They're quiet ones. But they're real. And when dopamine learns to value them, everything changes. Because you stop needing more to feel okay. You stop needing bigger, better, newer to feel satisfied. You discover that enough has been here all along. This isn't toxic positivity. It's not pretending bad things don't exist. It's training your attention, training your dopamine, to notice the good as readily as it notices the bad. Because right now, for most people, the system is biased toward negative, toward threat, toward problem. That made sense evolutionarily. Noticing danger kept you alive. But in the modern world, where most of us aren't facing life or death threats daily, that bias just makes us miserable. Gratitude rebalances it. It says, yes, there are problems, but there's also good, and both are true. And which you focus on determines how you feel. Let's discuss dopamine and solitude now, because being alone affects dopamine in complex ways. For some people, solitude is restorative. It quiets the social dopamine circuits, removes the pressure to perform, to respond, to engage, and in that quiet, they recharge. For others, solitude is torture. The social dopamine circuits start screaming for input. The loneliness feels physical. The absence of connection registers as pain. Neither is wrong. They're just different dopamine baselines. Some people have social reward systems that need less input. They can go days with minimal interaction and feel fine. Others need frequent connection, daily contact. Regular validation that they matter, that they're seen. The key is knowing your needs and honoring them. If you need solitude, take it, without guilt, without calling it antisocial. It's just your dopamine system resetting. But if you need connection, seek it, without shame, without calling it needy. It's just your dopamine system asking for what it requires to function. The problem comes when culture tells you one is better than the other, when extroversion is celebrated and introversion is pathologized, or vice versa. When we forget that brains are different. And different isn't wrong, so pay attention. What actually restores you? Not what should. Not what looks good, but what actually leaves you feeling more yourself. And then build your life around that. Because forcing your dopamine system to operate against its nature is exhausting and unnecessary. Let's talk about dopamine and rituals now, because rituals are dopamine anchors, small, repeated actions that signal to your brain, this is important, this is sacred, this is ours. Morning coffee, evening walks, Sunday dinners, bedtime routines. These aren't just habits, they're dopamine markers. They create predictability in an unpredictable world. They give your brain something to look forward to, something to return to, something steady. And in that steadiness, there's comfort, there's reward, not excitement, but something deeper, belonging, continuity, home. Rituals also create boundaries. They mark beginnings and endings. The morning ritual says, the day is starting. The evening ritual says, work is done. And your dopamine system learns to shift accordingly, to ramp up, to wind down, to transition. Without rituals, days blur together. Work bleeds into rest, activity bleeds into sleep, and your dopamine system never knows what mode to be in. So it stays alert, always on, always ready, always exhausted. Rituals give it permission to shift, to rest, to celebrate, to just be. This is why holidays matter, why birthdays matter, why traditions matter. They're not frivolous. They're neurochemical anchors. They tell your dopamine system this moment is different. This moment is special. Pay attention. And in paying attention, you create memory. You create meaning. You create the texture of a life well lived. So if you don't have rituals, create them. Small ones, simple ones. A candle lit each evening. A song played each morning. A phrase spoken before meals. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is the repetition, the intention, the marking of time. Because your dopamine system is listening, and it will learn. This is important. This is ours. This is home. Let's explore dopamine and fear now. Because fear and dopamine are intertwined in surprising ways. When you're afraid, dopamine doesn't shut down. It intensifies. It marks everything as salient, everything as important, everything as potentially dangerous. This is why fear is so consuming, why it takes over your whole mind. Your dopamine system is in overdrive, trying to keep you safe. But here's the paradox. The same dopamine surge that helps you survive real danger can trap you in imagined danger, because your brain doesn't always distinguish between actual threats and perceived threats, between a tiger in the room and a worry in your mind. Both trigger dopamine. Both feel urgent. Both demand attention. This is anxiety. A dopamine system stuck in fear mode, constantly scanning for threat, constantly anticipating danger, constantly preparing for disaster. And the more you engage with the fear, the more you rehearse the worry, the stronger the dopamine pattern becomes. Your brain learns this is important. Keep thinking about this. Keep preparing. Keep worrying. And the loop tightens. Breaking anxiety requires teaching dopamine new patterns, teaching it that not every uncertainty is danger, that not every unknown is threat, that sometimes the scariest thing to do is nothing, to sit with the discomfort, to let the fear arise without responding to it, without trying to solve it, without feeding it with attention. This is exposure therapy, deliberately facing the fear without the feared outcome happening. And slowly, over time, dopamine learns. This isn't actually dangerous. This doesn't actually require my attention. This can be let go. It's terrifying at first, because every instinct is screaming, do something, fix this, escape. But if you stay, if you don't give in, the dopamine signal weakens. The fear loses its power. Not because it goes away, but because you stop reinforcing it. You stop teaching your brain that it matters. Let's discuss dopamine and play now, because play is pure dopamine joy. Not productive, not useful, just fun. And in our productivity-obsessed culture, we've forgotten how important that is. Play doesn't have a goal. It doesn't optimize anything. It doesn't move you towards success. It just feels good. And that's the point. Your dopamine system needs play, needs moments that aren't about becoming better or achieving more, just about being alive, about enjoying the moment for no reason other than it's enjoyable. Children understand this instinctively. They play constantly. They find joy in the simplest things. A box becomes a castle. A stick becomes a sword. Imagination transforms everything, and their dopamine systems are learning. The world is full of possibility. Life is an adventure. Joy is everywhere. But as we grow up, we're taught to put away childish things, to be serious, to be productive, to make everything count. And slowly, play disappears. We call it wasting time. We feel guilty for it. We can't justify it. And our dopamine systems suffer because all pursuit and no play makes for a gray life. A life where everything is means and nothing is end, where you're always working towards something but never actually enjoying anything. So bring back play, not as a tool, not as self-care, not as a strategy for better productivity, just as play. Throw a frisbee, dance badly, make art you'll never show anyone, sing in the car, play with a dog, build something useless. Let yourself be silly, inefficient, unoptimized, and notice how it feels, how your body relaxes, how your mind lightens, how dopamine flows not because you're achieving, but because you're alive. That's a kind of dopamine we're starving for, and it's been waiting, patiently, for you to remember it exists. Let's explore dopamine and death now, because awareness of mortality changes how dopamine functions. When you truly grasp that your time is limited, that one day you won't be here, dopamine priorities shift. The shallow rewards matter less. The deep ones matter more. This is why people who've had near-death experiences often report profound changes. They stop caring about status, about accumulation, about what others think, and they start caring about love, about presence, about meaning. It's not that they become different people. It's that their dopamine systems recalibrate. Death awareness acts like a filter. It asks, does this actually matter? Will I regret spending my time this way? Is this how I want to use my finite attention? And suddenly, a lot of things that seemed important reveal themselves as distractions. The approval of strangers, the pursuit of more, the endless optimization. They fall away. Not because you've given up, but because you've remembered what actually nourishes. This is why memento mori, remember you will die, is such a powerful practice. It's not morbid. It's clarifying. It helps dopamine distinguish between what's truly rewarding and what's just noise. Of course, most of us don't live with death awareness. We push it away. We pretend we have infinite time. And in that pretending, we waste dopamine on things that don't matter. We scroll when we could connect. We accumulate when we could appreciate. We delay when we could act. Not because we're bad, because we've forgotten. We've forgotten that this is it. This day, this moment, this one wild and precious life. And dopamine, patient molecule that it is, will follow wherever you lead it. Toward depth or distraction, toward meaning or noise. The choice is always yours. And death, far from being the enemy, is the teacher, reminding you to choose well, to spend your dopamine on what actually matters. Before time runs out, let's talk about dopamine and awe now, because awe is one of the most powerful dopamine experiences we can have. When you encounter something vast, something that transcends your understanding, the Grand Canyon, the night sky, a piece of music that moves you to tears, dopamine and several other neurochemicals flood your brain, but not in the usual way, not in the seeking way. in the surrender way. Awe makes you feel small, but not in a bad way, in a way that puts everything in perspective. Your worries shrink. Your ego quiets. You remember you're part of something larger. And in that remembering, there's a strange peace. That dopamine satisfaction that doesn't come from getting something, but from seeing something, from being changed by beauty, by vastness, by mystery. This is why people seek out awe experiences. Hiking to mountaintops, visiting cathedrals, standing at the ocean, watching storms, stargazing, not because these things are useful, but because they reset something deep in the dopamine system. They remind you what wonder feels like, what it means to be moved, to be shaken out of the ordinary. And in that shaking, everything else adjusts. The petty concerns fade, the obsessive loops loosen, the constant striving quiets, and you remember, oh, right, this is what it feels like to be alive. Not achieving, not accumulating, just witnessing, just being part of this magnificent, incomprehensible universe. Awe is free. It's everywhere. In a perfect flower, in a child's laughter, in an act of unexpected kindness. You don't have to travel far. You just have to pay attention, to slow down enough to let it in. And when you do, when you let yourself be awed, your dopamine system learns. This is what we're here for. Not the next level, not the next like this beauty, this moment, this mysterious gift of being alive. Let's discuss dopamine and legacy now, because thinking about what you'll leave behind changes your dopamine orientation. If your rewards are all immediate, if your dopamine is all about right now, you won't build anything lasting. You'll consume, you'll chase, you'll get through the day. But if you can imagine someone in the future being affected by what you do now, a child you're raising, a garden you're planting, a skill you're teaching, a story you're writing, dopamine shifts. It becomes patient. It becomes willing to wait, to work without immediate reward. Because the reward isn't immediate. It's in the ripple, in the impact, in the difference you make that outlasts you. This is generativity, the drive to create something that benefits those who come after. And it's deeply dopamine rewarding, not in the quick hit way, in the deep satisfaction way. The way that makes you feel like your life mattered, like you were here for a reason, like the world is a little better because you passed through it. You don't have to do something grand. You don't have to cure a disease or write a masterpiece. You just have to care about something beyond yourself. To plant trees you won't sit under. To teach someone something useful. To make one small corner of the world a little kinder. And your dopamine system, which has been so focused on self, on survival, on getting yours, it finally relaxes, because it's found something worth working toward, something that doesn't require you to keep chasing, something that just asks you to contribute. And in contributing, you discover a dopamine you didn't know existed, the dopamine of enough, of done, of given, of complete. We're coming to the end now, and I want to talk about dopamine and acceptance, because all this understanding, all this awareness, all this learning, it can become another form of control, another way to optimize, another thing to perfect. And that misses the point, because the point isn't to control dopamine. The point is to understand it so you can stop fighting yourself, so you can recognize that you're not broken. You're biological, and biology can be worked with, can be partnered with, can be honored. Acceptance means recognizing that you will crave. You will be pulled. You will sometimes choose the easy thing over the hard thing, and that's okay. It's human. It's dopamine doing its job. The goal isn't to never crave. The goal is to not be at war with your cravings, to see them, to understand them, to choose consciously when to follow and when to redirect, and to forgive yourself when you don't choose perfectly, because perfect doesn't exist. There is no perfect dopamine life. There's just your life, with all its loops and cravings and contradictions. And the more you can meet it with compassion, with curiosity, with acceptance, the gentler everything becomes. The system softens, the fight eases, and you discover that the enemy was never dopamine. The enemy was the belief that you should be different than you are, that you should want different things, feel different things, be someone other than yourself. But you're this specific human, with this specific brain, with this specific dopamine landscape, and that's not wrong. It's just what is. And from that what is, from that acceptance, real change becomes possible. Not forced, not shamed, just gentle, patient, kind. So as you drift now towards sleep, as your dopamine settles into its nighttime rhythm, let all of this go. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to do anything with it. Just let it settle. Let it integrate. Let it become part of how you see yourself. And know that tomorrow, dopamine will whisper again, will pull again, will offer its 1,000 tiny suggestions, and you'll choose. Sometimes wisely, sometimes not, and both are okay, because this is the dance. This is the human experience. This is what it means to be alive, to be chemical, to be conscious, to be choosing all at once. And maybe that's the real gift. Not control, not perfection, just awareness, just the ability to see yourself clearly, to understand the whispers, to recognize the pull, and to choose gently, kindly, what kind of life you want to build. One small dopamine decision at a time. So rest now, sleep now, let your brain do its quiet work, consolidating, pruning, preparing, and wake tomorrow knowing you're not controlled by dopamine. You're dancing with it, learning its rhythm, finding your own, and that dance, imperfect and beautiful, is yours. Thank you for walking this long path with me, for giving me your attention, your time, your trust. I hope you've found something here worth keeping, some small shift in how you see yourself, some gentle permission to be human, some recognition that you're doing better than you think. Sleep well, dear friend, and may your dopamine tomorrow flow toward what truly nourishes you, toward what makes you feel alive, toward what matters. Good night.